A View from a Hill by M.R. James. How pleasant it can be, alone in a first-class railway carriage, on the first day of a holiday that is to be fairly long, to dawdle through a bit of English country that is unfamiliar, stopping at every station. You have a map open on your knee, and you pick out the villages that lie to right and left by their church towers. You marvel at the complete stillness that attends your stoppage at the stations, broken only by a footstep crunching the gravel. Yet perhaps that is best experienced after sundown, and the traveller I have in mind was making his leisurely progress on a sunny afternoon in the latter half of June. He was in the depths of the country. I need not particularize further than to say that if you divided the map of England into 4 quarters, he would have been found in the southwestern of them. He was a man of academic pursuits, and his term was just over. He was on his way to meet a new friend, older than himself. The two of them had met first on an official inquiry in town, had found that they had many tastes and habits in common, liked each other, and the result was an invitation from Squire Richards to Mr. Fanshawe, which was now taking effect. The journey ended about 5 o'clock. Fanshawe was told by a cheerful country porter that the car from the hall had been up to the station and left a message that something had to be fetched from half a mile farther on, and would the gentleman please to wait a few minutes till it came back. "But I see," continued the porter, "as you've got your bicycle, and very like you'd find it pleasanter to ride up to the hall yourself. Straight up the road here, and then first turn to the left. It ain't above 2 mile, and I'll see as your things is put in the car for you. You'll excuse me mentioning it, only I thought it were a nice evening for a ride. Yes, sir, very seasonable weather for the haymakers. Let me see. I have your bike ticket. Thank you, sir, much obliged. You can't miss your road," etc., etc. The 2 miles to the hall were just what was needed, after the day in the train, to dispel somnolence and impart a wish for tea. The hall, when sighted, also promised just what was needed in the way of a quiet resting place, after days of sitting on committees and college meetings. It was neither excitingly old nor depressingly new. Plastered walls, sash windows, old trees, smooth lawns were the features which Fanshawe noticed as he came up the drive. Squire Richards, a burly man of 60-odd, was awaiting him in the porch with evident pleasure. "Tea first," he said. "Or would you like a longer drink? No? All right. Tea's ready in the garden. Come along, they'll put your machine away. I always have tea under the lime tree by the stream on a day like this." Nor could you ask for a better place. Midsummer afternoon, shade and scent of a vast lime tree, cool, swirling water within 5 yards. It was long before either of them suggested a move. But about 6, Mr. Richards sat up, knocked out his pipe, and said, "Look here, it's cool enough now to think of a stroll, if you're inclined. All right, then what I suggest is that we walk up the park and get onto the hillside, where we can look over the country. We'll have a map, and I'll show you where things are, and you can go off on your machine, or we can take the car, according as you want exercise or not. If you're ready, we can start now, and be back well before 8, taking it very easy." "I'm ready. I should like my stick, though. And have you got any field glasses? I lent mine to a man a week ago, and he's gone off Lord knows where, and taken them with him." Mr. Richards pondered. "Yes," he said, "I have, but they're not things I use myself, and I don't know whether the ones I have will suit you. They're old-fashioned, and about twice as heavy as they make 'em now. You're welcome to have them, but I won't carry them. By the way, what do you want to drink after dinner?" Protestations that anything would do were overruled, and a satisfactory settlement was reached on the way to the front hall, where Mr. Fanshawe found his stick, and Mr. Richards, after thoughtful pinching of his lower lip, resorted to a drawer in the hall table, extracted a key, crossed to a cupboard in the panelling, opened it, took a box from the shelf, and put it on the table. "The glasses are in there," he said, "and there's some dodge of opening it, but I've forgotten what it is. You try." Mr. Fanshawe accordingly tried. There was no keyhole, and the box was solid, heavy, and smooth. It seemed obvious that some part of it would have to be pressed before anything could happen. "The corners," said he to himself, "are the likely places, and infernally sharp corners they are too," he added, as he put his thumb in his mouth, after exerting force on a lower corner. "What's the matter?" said the squire. "Why, your disgusting Borgia box has scratched me, drat it," said Fanshawe. The squire chuckled unfeelingly. "Well, you've got it open, anyway," he said. "So I have. Well, I don't begrudge a drop of blood in a good cause. And here are the glasses. They are pretty heavy, as you said, but I think I'm equal to carrying them." "Ready?" said the squire. "Come on, then. We'll go out by the garden." So they did, and passed out into the park, which sloped decidedly upwards to the hill which, as Fanshawe had seen from the train, dominated the country. It was a spur of a larger range that lay behind. On the way, the squire, who was great on earthworks, pointed out various spots where he detected or imagined traces of war ditches and the like. "And here," he said, stopping on a more or less level plot with a ring of large trees, "is Baxter's Roman villa." "Baxter?" said Mr. Fanshawe. "I forgot. You don't know about him. He was the old chap I got those glasses from. I believe he made them. He was an old watchmaker down in the village, a great antiquary. My father gave him leave to grub about where he liked, and when he made a find he used to lend him a man or two to help him with the digging. He got a surprising lot of things together, and when he died, I dare say it's 10 or 15 years ago, I bought the whole lot and gave them to the town museum. We'll run in one of these days and look over them. The glasses came to me with the rest, but of course I kept them. If you look at them, you'll see they're more or less amateur work. The body of them, naturally the lenses weren't of his making." "Yes, I see they are just the sort of thing that a clever workman in a different line of business might turn out. But I don't see why he made them so heavy. And did Baxter actually find a Roman villa here?" "Yes, there's a pavement turfed over where we're standing. It was too rough and plain to be worth taking up, but of course there are drawings of it, and the small things and pottery that turned up were quite good of their kind. An ingenious chap, old Baxter. He seemed to have a quite out-of-the-way instinct for these things. He was invaluable to our archaeologists. He used to shut up his shop for days at a time and wander off over the district, marking down places where he scented anything on the ordnance map, and he kept a book with fuller notes of the places. Since his death, a good many of them have been sampled, and there's always been something to justify him." "Oh, what a good man," said Mr. Fanshawe. "Good?" said the squire, pulling up brusquely. I meant useful to have about the place," said Mr. Fanshawe. "But was he a villain?" "I don't know about that either," said the squire. "But all I can say is, if he was good, he wasn't lucky. And he wasn't liked. I didn't like him," he added, after a moment. "Oh?" said Fanshawe, interrogatively. "No, I didn't. But that's enough about Baxter. Besides, this is the stiffest bit, and I don't want to talk and walk as well." Indeed, it was hot, climbing a slippery grass slope that evening. "I told you I should take you the short way," panted the squire, "and I wish I hadn't. However, a bath won't do us any harm when we get back. Here we are, and here's the seat." A small clump of old Scotch firs crowned the top of the hill, and at the edge of it, Commanding the cream of the view was a wide and solid seat, on which the two disposed themselves, and wiped their brows, and regained breath. "Now then," said the squire, as soon as he was in a condition to talk connectedly, "this is where your glasses come in, but you'd better take a general look round first. My word, I've never seen the view look better. Writing, as I am now, with a winter wind flapping against dark windows, and a rushing, tumbling sea within 100 yards, I find it hard to summon up the feelings and words which will put my reader in possession of the June evening and the lovely English landscape of which the squire was speaking. Across a broad level plain they looked upon ranges of great hills, whose uplands, some green, some furred with woods, caught the light of a sun, westering but not yet low. And all the plain was fertile, though the river which traversed it was nowhere seen. There were copses, green wheat, hedges, and pasture land. The little compact white moving cloud marked the evening train. Then the eye picked out red farms and grey houses, and nearer home scattered cottages, and then the hall, nestled under the hill. The smoke of chimneys was very blue and straight. There was a smell of hay in the air. There were wild roses on bushes hard by. It was the acme of summer. After some minutes of silent contemplation, the squire began to point out the leading features, the hills and valleys, and told where the towns and villages lay. "Now," he said, "with the glasses you'll be able to pick out Fulnaker Abbey. Take a line across that big green field, then over the wood beyond it, then over the farm on the knoll." Yes, said Fanshawe. "I've got it. What a fine tower!" "You must have got the wrong direction," said the squire. "There's not much of a tower about there that I remember, unless it's Oldbourne Church that you've got hold of, and if you call that a fine tower, you're easily pleased." "Well, I do call it a fine tower," said Fanshawe, the glasses still at his eyes, "whether it's Oldbourne or any other, and it must belong to a largish church. It looks to me like a central tower, 4 big pinnacles at the corners, and 4 smaller ones between. I must certainly go over there. How far is it?" "Oldbourne's about 9 miles, or less," said the squire. "It's a long time since I've been there, but I don't remember thinking much of it. Now, I'll show you another thing." Fanshawe had lowered the glasses, and was still gazing in the Oldbourne direction. "No," he said, "I can't make out anything with the naked eye. What was it you were going to show me?" "A good deal more to the left. It oughtn't to be difficult to find. Do you see a rather sudden knob of a hill with a thick wood on top of it? It's in a dead line with that single tree on the top of the big ridge." "I do," said Fanshawe, "and I believe I could tell you without much difficulty what it's called." "Could you now?" said the squire. "Say on." "Why, Gallows Hill," was the answer. "How did you guess that?" "Well, if you don't want it guessed, you shouldn't put up a dummy gibbet and a man hanging on it." "What's that?" said the squire abruptly. "There's nothing on that hill but wood." "On the contrary," said Fanshawe, "there's a largish expanse of grass on the top, and your dummy gibbet in the middle, and I thought there was something on it when I looked first, but I see there's nothing. Or is there? I can't be sure." "Nonsense, Fanshawe. There's no such thing as a dummy gibbet, or any other sort, on that hill. And it's thick wood, a fairly young plantation. I was in it myself not a year ago. Hand me the glasses, though I don't suppose I can see anything." After a pause, "No, I thought not. They won't show a thing." Meanwhile, Fanshawe was scanning the hill. It might be only 2 or 3 miles away. "Well, it's very odd," he said. "It does look exactly like a wood without the glass." He took it again. "That is one of the oddest effects. The gibbet is perfectly plain, and the grass field, and there even seem to be people on it, and carts, or a cart, with men in it. And yet, when I take the glass away, there's nothing. It must be something in the way this afternoon light falls. I shall come up earlier in the day, when the sun's full on it." "Did you say you saw people and a cart on that hill?" said the squire, incredulously. "What should they be doing there, at this time of day, even if the trees have been felled? Do talk sense. Look again." "Well, I certainly thought I saw them. Yes, I should say there were a few, just clearing off. And now, by Jove, it does look like something hanging on the gibbet. But these glasses are so beastly heavy, I can't hold them steady for long. Anyway, you can take it from me there's no wood, and if you'll show me the road on the map, I'll go there tomorrow." The squire remained brooding for some little time. At last he rose and said, "Well, I suppose that will be the best way to settle it. And now we'd better be getting back. Bath and dinner is my idea." And on the way back, he was not very communicative. They returned through the garden, and went into the front hall to leave sticks, etc., in their due place. And here they found the aged butler Patten, evidently in a state of some anxiety. "Beg pardon, Master Henry," he began at once, "but someone's been up to mischief here, I'm much afraid." He pointed to the open box which had contained the glasses. "Nothing worse than that, Patten," said the squire. "Mayn't I take out my own glasses and lend them to a friend? Bought with my own money, you recollect, at old Baxter's sale, eh?" Patten bowed, unconvinced. "Oh, very well, Master Henry, as long as you know who it was. Only I thought it proper to name it, for I didn't think that box had been off its shelf since you first put it there. And if you'll excuse me, after what happened—" The voice was lowered, and the rest was not audible to Fanshawe. The squire replied with a few words and a gruff laugh, and called on Fanshawe to come and be shown his room. And I do not think that anything else happened that night which bears on my story. Except, perhaps, the sensation which invaded Fanshawe in the small hours, that something had been let out which ought not to have been let out. It came into his dreams. He was walking in a garden which he seemed half to know, and stopped in front of a rockery made of old wrought stones, pieces of window tracery from a church, and even bits of figures. One of these moved his curiosity. It seemed to be a sculptured capital, with scenes carved on it. He felt he must pull it out, and worked away, and, with an ease that surprised him, moved the stones that obscured it aside, and pulled out the block. As he did so, a tin label fell down by his feet with a little clatter. He picked it up and read on it, "On no account move this stone. Yours sincerely, J. Patten." As often happens in dreams, he felt that this injunction was of extreme importance, and with an anxiety that amounted to anguish, he looked to see if the stone had really been shifted. Indeed it had. In fact, he could not see it anywhere. The removal had disclosed the mouth of a burrow, and he bent down to look into it. Something stirred in the blackness, and then, to his intense horror, a hand emerged. A clean right hand, in a neat cuff and coat sleeve, just in the attitude of a hand that means to shake yours. He wondered whether it would not be rude to let it alone. But as he looked at it, it began to grow hairy, and dirty, and thin, and also to change its pose, and stretch out, as if to take hold of his leg. At that, he dropped all thought of politeness, decided to run, screamed, and woke himself up. This was the dream he remembered, but it seemed to him, as again it often does, that there had been others of the same import before, but not so insistent. He lay awake for some little time, fixing the details of the last dream in his mind, and wondering, in particular, what the figures had been which he had seen, or half seen, on the carved capital. Something quite incongruous, he felt sure, but that was the most he could recall. Whether because of the dream, or because it was the first day of his holiday, he did not get up very early. Nor did he at once plunge into the exploration of the country. He spent a morning, half lazy, half instructive, in looking over the volumes of the County Archaeological Society's transactions, in which were many contributions from Mr. Baxter, on finds of flint implements, Roman sites, ruins of monastic establishments, in fact, most departments of archaeology. They were written in an odd, pompous, only half-educated style. If the man had had more early schooling, thought Fanshawe, he would have been a very distinguished antiquary. Or he might have been, he thus qualified his opinion a little later, but for a certain love of opposition and controversy, and, yes, a patronizing tone, as of one possessing superior knowledge, which left an unpleasant taste. He might have been a very respectable artist. There was an imaginary restoration and elevation of a priory church, which was very well conceived. A fine, pinnacled, central tower was a conspicuous feature of this. It reminded Fanshawe of that which he had seen from the hill, and which the squire had told him must be Oldbourne. But it was not Oldbourne. It was Fulnaker Priory. Oh well, he said to himself, I suppose Oldbourne Church may have been built by Fulnaker monks, and Baxter has copied Oldbourne Tower. Anything about it in the letterpress? Ah, I see it was published after his death. Found among his papers. After lunch, the squire asked Fanshawe what he meant to do. Well, said Fanshawe, I think I shall go out on my bike about 4, as far as Oldbourne, and back by Gallows Hill. That ought to be a round of about 15 miles, oughtn't it? About that, said the squire. And you'll pass Lambsfield and Wanstone, both of which are worth looking at. There's a little glass at Lambsfield, and the stone at Wanstone. Good, said Fanshawe. I'll get tea somewhere, and may I take the glasses? I'll strap them on my bike, on the carrier. Of course, if you like, said the squire. I really ought to have some better ones. If I go into the town today, I'll see if I can pick up some. Why should you trouble to do that, if you can't use them yourself? Said Fanshawe. Oh, I don't know. One ought to have a decent pair, and, well, old Patton doesn't think those are fit to use. Is he a judge? He's got some tale. I don't know. Something about old Baxter. I promised to let him tell me about it. It seems very much on his mind since last night. Why that? Did he have a nightmare like me? He had something. He was looking an old man this morning, and he said he hadn't closed an eye. Well, let him save up his tale till I come back. Very well. I will if I can. Look here, are you going to be late? If you get a puncture 8 miles off and have to walk home, what then? I don't trust these bicycles. I shall tell them to give us cold things to eat. I shan't mind that, whether I'm late or early, but I've got things to mend punctures with. And now I'm off. It was just as well that the squire had made that arrangement about a cold supper, Fanshawe thought, and not for the first time, as he wheeled his bicycle up the drive about 9 o'clock. So also the squire thought, and said, several times, as he met him in the hall, rather pleased at the confirmation of his want of faith in bicycles, than sympathetic with his hot, weary, thirsty, and indeed haggard friend. In fact, the kindest thing he found to say was, "You'll want a long drink tonight. Cider cup do? All right. Hear that, Patton? Cider cup, iced, lots of it." Then to Fanshawe, "Don't be all night over your bath." By 9:30 they were at dinner, and Fanshawe was reporting progress, if progress it might be called. I got to Lambsfield very smoothly and saw the glass. It is very interesting stuff, but there's a lot of lettering I couldn't read. "Not with glasses?" said the squire. "Those glasses of yours are no manner of use inside a church, or inside anywhere, I suppose, for that matter, but the only places I took 'em into were churches." "Well, go on," said the squire. "However, I took some sort of a photograph of the window, and I dare say an enlargement would show what I want. Then one stone. I should think that stone was a very out-of-the-way thing, only I don't know about that class of antiquities. Has anybody opened the mound it stands on?" "Baxter wanted to, but the farmer wouldn't let him." "Oh, well, I should think it would be worth doing. Anyhow, the next thing was Fulnaker and Oldbourne. You know, it's very odd about that tower I saw from the hill. Oldbourne Church is nothing like it, and of course there's nothing over 30 feet high at Fulnaker, though you can see it had a central tower. I didn't tell you, did I, that Baxter's fancy drawing of Fulnaker shows a tower exactly like the one I saw?" "So you thought, I dare say," put in the squire. "No, it wasn't a case of thinking. The picture actually reminded me of what I'd seen, and I made sure it was Oldbourne well before I looked at the title." "Well, Baxter had a very fair idea of architecture. I dare say what's left made it easy for him to draw the right sort of tower." "Well, that may be it, of course, but I'm doubtful if even a professional could have got it so exactly right. There's absolutely nothing left at Fulnaker but the bases of the piers which supported it. However, that isn't the oddest thing." "What about Gallows Hill?" said the squire. "Here, Patton, listen to this. I told you what Mr. Fanshawe said he saw from the hill." "Yes, Master Henry, you did, and I can't say I was so much surprised, considering." All right, you keep that till afterwards. We want to hear what Mr. Fanshawe saw today. Go on, Fanshawe. You turned to come back by Ackford and Thorfield, I suppose?" "Yes, and I looked into both the churches. Then I got to the turning which goes to the top of Gallows Hill. I saw that if I wheeled my machine over the field at the top of the hill, I could join the home road on this side. It was about 6:30 when I got to the top of the hill, and there was a gate on my right, where it ought to be, leading into the belt of plantation." "You hear that, Patton? A belt, he says." "Well, so I thought it was. A belt. But it wasn't. You were quite right, and I was hopelessly wrong. I cannot understand it. The whole top is planted quite thick. Well, I went on into this wood, wheeling and dragging my bike, expecting every minute to come to a clearing, and then my misfortunes began. Thorns, I suppose. First I realized that the front tire was slack, then the back. I couldn't stop to do more than try to find the punctures and mark them, but even that was hopeless, so I ploughed on, and the farther I went, the less I liked the place. "Not much poaching in that cover, eh, Patton?" said the squire. "No, indeed, Master Henry. There's very few cares to go—" "No, I know. Never mind that now. Go on, Fanshawe." "I don't blame anybody for not caring to go there. I know I had all the fancies one least likes. Steps crackling over twigs behind me. Indistinct people stepping behind trees in front of me. Yes, and even a hand laid on my shoulder. I pulled up very sharp at that and looked round, but there really was no branch or bush that could have done it. Then, when I was just about at the middle of the plot, I was convinced that there was someone looking down on me from above, and not with any pleasant intent. I stopped again, or at least slackened my pace, to look up, and as I did, down I came, and barked my shins abominably on, what do you think? A block of stone with a big square hole in the top of it. And within a few paces there were two others, just like it. The three were set in a triangle. Now, do you make out what they were put there for? I think I can, said the squire, who was now very grave and absorbed in the story. Sit down, Patten. It was time, for the old man was supporting himself by one hand and leaning heavily on it. He dropped into a chair and said, in a very tremulous voice, "You didn't go between them stones, did you, sir?" "I did not," said Fanshawe, emphatically. I dare say I was an ass, but as soon as it dawned on me where I was, I just shouldered my machine and did my best to run. It seemed to me as if I was in an unholy, evil sort of graveyard, and I was most profoundly thankful that it was one of the longest days, and still sunlight. Well, I had a horrid run, even if it was only a few 100 yards. Everything caught on everything, handles and spokes and carriers and pedals, caught in them viciously, or I fancied so. I fell over at least 5 times. At last I saw the hedge, and I couldn't trouble to hunt for the gate. "There is no gate on my side," the squire interpolated. Just as well I didn't waste time then. I dropped the machine over somehow and went into the road pretty near head first. Some branch or something got my ankle at the last moment. Anyhow, there I was, out of the wood, and seldom more thankful or more generally sore. Then came the job of mending my punctures. I had a good outfit, and I'm not at all bad at the business, but this was an absolutely hopeless case. It was 7 when I got out of the wood, and I spent 50 minutes over one tire. As fast as I found a hole and put on a patch and blew it up, it went flat again. So I made up my mind to walk. That hill isn't 3 miles away, is it? Not more across country, but nearer 6 by road. I thought it must be. I thought I couldn't have taken well over the hour, over less than 5 miles, even leading a bike. Well, there's my story. Where's yours and Patten's? "Mine? I've no story," said the squire. "But you weren't very far out when you thought you were in a graveyard. There must be a good few of them up there, Patten, don't you think? They left them there when they fell to bits, I fancy." Patten nodded, too much interested to speak. "Don't," said Fanshawe. "Now then, Patten," said the squire, "you've heard what sort of a time Mr. Fanshawe's been having. What do you make of it? Anything to do with Mr. Baxter? Fill yourself a glass of port and tell us." "Ah, that done me good, Master Henry," said Patten, after absorbing what was before him. "If you really wish to know what were in my thoughts, my answer would be clear in the affirmative. Yes," he went on, warming to his work, "I should say as Mr. Fanshawe's experience of today were very largely due to the person you named. And I think, Master Henry, as I have some title to speak, in view of me having been many years on speaking terms with him, and swore in to be jury on the coroner's inquest near this time 10 years ago. You being then, if you carry your mind back, Master Henry, travelling abroad, and no one here to represent the family." "Inquest," said Fanshawe. "An inquest on Mr. Baxter, was there?" "Yes, sir, on on that very person. The facts as led up to that occurrence was these. The deceased was, as you may have gathered, a very peculiar individual in his habits. In my idea, at least, but all must speak as they find. He lived very much to himself, without neither chick nor child, as the saying is, and how he passed away his time was what very few could offer a guess at. He lived unknown, and few could know when Baxter ceased to be, said the squire to his pipe. I beg pardon, Master Henry, I was just coming to that. But when I say how he passed away his time, to be sure, we know how intent he was in rummaging and ransacking out all the history of the neighbourhood, and the number of things he'd managed to collect together. Well, it was spoke of for miles round as Baxter's Museum, and many a time, when he might be in the mood, and I might have an hour to spare, have he showed me his pieces of pots and what not, going back, by his account, to the times of the ancient Romans. However, you know more about that than what I do, Master Henry. Only what I was a-going to say was this. As know what he might, and interesting as he might be in his talk, there was something about the man. Well, for one thing, no one ever remembered to see him in church, nor yet chapel, at service time, and that made talk. Our rector, he never come in the house but once. Never asked me what the man said. That was all anybody could ever get out of him. Then how did he spend his nights, particularly about this season of the year? Time and again the labouring men 'ud meet him coming back as they went out to their work, and he'd pass 'em by without a word, looking, they says, like someone straight out of the asylum. They see the whites of his eyes, all round. He'd have a fish basket with him, that they noticed, and he always come the same road. And the talk got to be that he'd made himself some business, and that not the best kind. Well, not so far from where you was, at 7 o'clock this evening, sir. Well, now, after such a night as that, Mr. Baxter, he'd shut up the shop, and the old lady that did for him had orders not to come in, and knowing what she did about his language, she took care to obey them orders. But one day, it so happened, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the house being shut up, as I said, there come a most fearful to-do inside, and smoke out of the windows, and Baxter crying out, seemingly in an agony. So the man as lived next door, he run round to the back premises and burst the door in. And several others come too. Well, he tell me he never in all his life smelt such a fearful, odour as what there was in that kitchen place. It seemed as if Baxter had been boiling something in a pot, and overset it on his leg. There he laid on the floor, trying to keep back the cries, but it was more than he could manage, and when he seen the people come in, he was in a nice condition. If his tongue warn't blistered worse than his leg, it warn't his fault. Well, they picked him up and got him into a chair, and run for the medical man, and one of 'em was going to pick up the pot, and Baxter, he screams out to let it alone. So he did, but he couldn't see as there was anything in the pot but a few old brown bones. Then they says, Dr. Lawrence'll be here in a minute, Mr. Baxter. He'll soon put you to rights. And then he was off again. He must be got up to his room. He couldn't have the doctor come in there and see all that mess. They must throw a cloth over it, anything, the tablecloth out of the parlour. Well, so they did, but that must have been poisonous stuff in that pot, for it was pretty near on 2 months afore Baxter were about again. Beg pardon, Master Henry, was you going to say something? Yes, I was, said the squire. I wonder you hadn't told me all this before. However, I was going to say, I remember old Lawrence telling me he'd attended Baxter. He was a queer card, he said. Lawrence was up in the bedroom one day, and picked up a little mask covered with black velvet, and put it on in fun, then went to look at himself in the glass. He hadn't time for a proper look, for old Baxter shouted to him from the bed, "Put it down, you fool! Do you want to look through a dead man's eyes?" And it startled him so that he did put it down, and then he asked Baxter what he meant, and Baxter insisted on him handing it over, and said the man he bought it from was dead, or some such nonsense. But Lawrence felt it as he handed it over, and he declared he was sure it was made out of the front of a skull. He bought a distilling apparatus at Baxter's sale, he told me, but he could never use it. It seemed to taint everything, however much he cleaned it. But, go on, Patton. Yes, Master Henry, I'm nearly done now, and time too, for I don't know what they'll think about me in the servants' hall. Well, this business of the scalding was some few years before Mr. Baxter was took, and he got about again, and went on just as he'd used. And one of the last jobs he'd done was finishing up them actual glasses, what you took out last night. You see, he'd made the body of them some long time, and got the pieces of glass for them, but there was something wanted to finish 'em. Whatever it was, I don't know, but I picked up the frame one day, and I says, "Mr. Baxter, why don't you make a job of this?" And he says, when I've done that, you'll hear news, you will. There's going to be no such pair of glasses as mine, when they're filled and sealed." And there he stopped, and I says, "Why, Mr. Baxter, you talk as if they was wine bottles. Filled and sealed? Why, where's the necessity for that?" "Did I say filled and sealed?" he says. "Oh, well, I was suiting my conversation to my company." Well then, come round this time of year, and one fine evening I was passing his shop on my way home, and he was standing on the step, very pleased with hisself, and he says, "All right and tight now. My best bit of work's finished, and I'll be out with 'em tomorrow." "What, finished them glasses?" I says. "Might I have a look at them?" No, he says. "I put 'em to bed for tonight, and when I do show 'em you, you'll have to pay for peeping, so I tell you." And that, gentlemen, were the last words I heard that man say. That were the 17th of June, and just a week after, there was a funny thing happened, and it was due to that as we brought in unsound mind at the inquest, for barring that, no one as knew Baxter in business could anyways have laid that against him. But George Williams, as lived in the next house, and do now, he was woke up that same night with a stumbling and tumbling about in Mr. Baxter's premises, and he got out of bed and went to the front window on the street to see if there was any rough customers about. And it being a very light night, he could make sure as there were not. Then he stood and listened, and he heard Mr. Baxter coming down his front stair, one step after another, very slow, and he got the idea as it was like someone being pushed or pulled down, and holding on to everything he could. Next thing, he heard the street door come open, and out come Mr. Baxter into the street in his day clothes, hat and all, with his arms straight down by his sides, and talking to hisself, and shaking his head from one side to the other, and walking in that peculiar way that he appeared to be going, as it were, against his own will. George Williams put up the window, and hear him say, "Oh, mercy, gentlemen!" And then he shut up sudden, as if, he said, someone clapped his hand over his mouth, and Mr. Baxter threw his head back, and his hat fell off. And Williams see his face looking something pitiful, so as he couldn't keep from calling out to him, "Why, Mr. Baxter, ain't you well?" And he was going to offer to fetch Dr. Lawrence to him, only he heard the answer, "'Tis best you mind your own business. Put in your head." But whether it were Mr. Baxter, said it, so hoarse-like and faint, He never could be sure. Still, there weren't no one but him in the street, and yet Williams was that upset by the way he spoke that he shrank back from the window and went and sat on the bed, and he heard Mr. Baxter's step go on and up the road, and after a minute or more he couldn't help but look out once more, and he see him going along the same curious way as before. And one thing he recollected was that Mr. Baxter never stopped to pick up his hat when it fell off, and yet there it was, on his head. Well, Master Henry, that was the last anybody see of Mr. Baxter, leastways for a week or more. There was a lot of people said he was called off on business, or made off because he'd got into some scrape, but he was well known for miles round, and none of the railway people nor the public-house people hadn't seen him. And then ponds was looked into, and nothing found, and at last, one evening, Fakes, the keeper, come down from over the hill to the village, and he says he's seen the Gallows Hill planting black with birds, and that were a funny thing, because he never see no sign of a creature there in his time. So they looked at each other a bit, and first one says, "I'm game to go up," and another says, "So am I, if you are," and half a dozen of them set out in the evening time, and took Dr. Lawrence with them. And you know, Master Henry, there he was, between them 3 stones, with his neck broke. Useless to imagine the talk which this story set going. It is not remembered. But before Patten left them, he said to Fanshawe, "Excuse me, sir, but did I understand as you took out them glasses with you today? I thought you did, and might I ask, did you make use of them at all?" "Yes, only to look at something in a church." "Oh, indeed. You took him into the church, did you, sir?" "Yes, I did. It was Lambsfield Church. By the way, I left them strapped on to my bicycle, I'm afraid, in the stable-yard." "No matter for that, sir. I can bring them in the first thing tomorrow, and perhaps you'll be so good as to look at 'em then." Accordingly, before breakfast, after a tranquil and well-earned sleep, Fanshawe took the glasses into the garden, and directed them to a distant hill. He lowered them instantly, and looked at top and bottom, worked the screws, tried them again, and yet again, shrugged his shoulders, and replaced them on the hall table. "Patten," he said, "they're absolutely useless. I can't see a thing. It's as if someone had stuck a black wafer over the lens." "Spoilt my glasses, have you?" said the squire. "Thank you. The only ones I've got." "You try them yourself," said Fanshawe. "I've done nothing to them." So, after breakfast, the squire took them out to the terrace, and stood on the steps. After a few ineffectual attempts, "Lord, how heavy they are!" he said impatiently, and in the same instant dropped them onto the stones, and the lens splintered, and the barrel cracked. A little pool of liquid formed on the stone slab. It was inky black, and the odour that rose from it is not to be described. "Filled and sealed, eh?" said the squire. "If I could bring myself to touch it, I dare say we should find the seal. So, that's what came of his boiling and distilling, is it? Old ghoul!" "What in the world do you mean?" "Don't you see, my good man? Remember what he said to the doctor about looking through dead men's eyes. Well, this was another way of it, but they didn't like having their bones boiled, I take it, and the end of it was they carried him off, whither he would not. Well, I'll get a spade, and we'll bury this thing decently." As they smoothed the turf over it, the squire, handing the spade to Patten, who had been a reverential spectator, remarked to Fanshawe, It's almost a pity you took that thing into the church. You might have seen more than you did. Baxter had them for a week, I make out, but I don't see that he did much in the time." "I'm not sure," said Fanshawe. "There is that picture of Fulnaker Priory Church." The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. Somebody asked for the cigars. We had talked long, and the conversation was beginning to languish. The tobacco smoke had got into the heavy curtains. The wine had got into those brains which were liable to become heavy, and it was already perfectly evident that, unless somebody did something to rouse our oppressed spirits, the meeting would soon come to its natural conclusion, and we, the guests, would speedily go home to bed, and most certainly to sleep. No one had said anything very remarkable. It may be that no one had anything very remarkable to say. Jones had given us every particular of his last hunting adventure in Yorkshire. Mr. Tomkins of Boston had explained at elaborate length those working principles, by the due and careful maintenance of which the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad not only extended its territory, increased its departmental influence, and transported livestock without starving them to death before the day of actual delivery, but also had for years succeeded in deceiving those passengers who bought its tickets into the fallacious belief that the corporation aforesaid was really able to transport human life without destroying it. Signor Tombola had endeavoured to persuade us, by arguments which we took no trouble to oppose, that the unity of his country in no way resembled the average modern torpedo, carefully planned, constructed with all the skill of the greatest European arsenals, but, when constructed, destined to be directed by feeble hands into a region where it must undoubtedly explode, unseen, unfeared, and unheard, into the illimitable wastes of political chaos. It is unnecessary to go into further details. The conversation had assumed proportions which would have bored Prometheus on his rock, which would have driven Tantalus to distraction, and which would have impelled Ixion to seek relaxation in the simple but instructive dialogues of Herr Ollendorf, rather than submit to the greater evil of listening to our talk. We had sat at table for hours. We were bored. We were tired, and nobody showed signs of moving. Somebody called for cigars. We all instinctively looked towards the speaker. Brisbane was a man of 35 years of age, and remarkable for those gifts which chiefly attract the attention of men. He was a strong man. The external proportions of his figure presented nothing extraordinary to the common eye, though his size was above the average. He was a little over 6 feet in height, and moderately broad in the shoulder. He did not appear to be stout, but, on the other hand, he was certainly not thin. His small head was supported by a strong and sinewy neck. His broad, muscular hands appeared to possess a peculiar skill in breaking walnuts without the assistance of the ordinary cracker, and, seeing him in profile, one could not help remarking the extraordinary breadth of his sleeves, and the unusual thickness of his chest. He was one of those men who are commonly spoken of among men as deceptive, that is to say, that though he looked exceedingly strong, he was, in reality, very much stronger than he looked. Of his features I need say little. His head is small, his hair is thin, his eyes are blue, his nose is large, he has a small moustache and a square jaw. Everybody knows Brisbane, and when he asked for a cigar, everybody looked at him. "It is a very singular thing," said Brisbane. Everybody stopped talking. Brisbane's voice was not loud, but possessed a peculiar quality of penetrating general conversation and cutting it like a knife. Everybody listened. Brisbane, perceiving that he had attracted their general attention, lit his cigar with great equanimity. "It is very singular," he continued, "that thing about ghosts. People are always asking whether anybody has seen a ghost. I have." "Bosh! What, you? You don't mean to say so, Brisbane. Well, for a man of his intelligence—" A chorus of exclamations greeted Brisbane's remarkable statement. Everybody called for cigars, and Stubbs, the butler, suddenly appeared from the depths of nowhere with a fresh bottle of dry champagne. The situation was saved. Brisbane was going to tell a story. "I am an old sailor," said Brisbane, "and as I have to cross the Atlantic pretty often, I have my favourites. Most men have their favourites. I have seen a man wait in a Broadway bar for 3/4 of an hour for a particular car which he liked. I believe the barkeeper made at least 1/3 of his living by that man's preference. I have a habit of waiting for certain ships when I am obliged to cross that duck pond. It may be a prejudice, but I was never cheated out of a good passage but once in my life. I remember it very well. It was a warm morning in June, and the custom-house officials, who were hanging about waiting for a steamer already on her way up from the quarantine, presented a peculiarly hazy and thoughtful appearance. I had not much luggage. I never have. I mingled with the crowd of passengers, porters, and officious individuals in blue coats and brass buttons, who seemed to spring up like mushrooms from the deck of a moored steamer to obtrude their unnecessary services upon the independent passenger. I have often noticed, with a certain interest, the spontaneous evolution of these fellows. They are not there when you arrive. 5 minutes after the pilot has called "Go ahead," they, or at least their blue coats and brass buttons, have disappeared from deck and gangway as completely as though they had been consigned to that locker which tradition unanimously ascribes to Davy Jones. But at the moment of starting, they are there, clean-shaved, blue-coated, and ravenous for fees. I hastened on board. The Kamchatka was one of my favourite ships. I say was, because she emphatically no longer is. I cannot conceive of any inducement which could entice me to make another voyage in her. Yes, I know what you are going to say. She is uncommonly clean in the run aft. She has enough bluffing off in the bows to keep her dry, and the lower berths are most of them double. She has a lot of advantages, but I won't cross in her again. Excuse the digression. I got on board. I hailed a steward whose red nose and redder whiskers were equally familiar to me. 105, lower berth, said I, in the business-like tone peculiar to men who think no more of crossing the Atlantic than taking a whisky cocktail at downtown Delmonico's. The steward took my portmanteau, greatcoat, and rug. I shall never forget the expression of his face. Not that he turned pale. It is maintained by the most eminent divines that even miracles cannot change the course of nature. I have no hesitation in saying that he did not turn pale. But, from his expression, I judged that he was either about to shed tears, to sneeze, or to drop my portmanteau. As the latter contained 2 bottles of particularly fine old sherry, presented to me for my voyage by my old friend Snigginson Van Pickens, I felt extremely nervous. But the steward did none of these things. "Well, I'm damned," said he, in a low voice, and led the way. I supposed my Hermes, as he led me to the lower regions, had had a little grog, but I said nothing, and followed him. 105 was on the port side, well aft. There was nothing remarkable about the stateroom. The lower berth, like most of those upon the Kamchatka, was double. There was plenty of room. There was the usual washing apparatus, calculated to convey an idea of luxury to the mind of a North American Indian. There were the usual inefficient racks of brown wood, in which it is more easy to hang a large-sized umbrella than the common toothbrush of commerce. Upon the uninviting mattresses were carefully folded together those blankets which a great modern humorist has aptly compared to cold buckwheat cakes. The question of towels was left entirely to the imagination. The glass decanters were filled with a transparent liquid, faintly tinged with brown, but from which an odour, less faint but not more pleasing, ascended to the nostrils, like a far-off seasick reminiscence of oily machinery. Sad-coloured curtains half-closed the upper berth. The hazy June daylight shed a faint illumination upon the desolate little scene. Ugh! How I hate that stateroom. The steward deposited my traps and looked at me, as though he wanted to get away, probably in search of more passengers and more fees. It is always a good plan to start in favour with those functionaries, and I accordingly gave him certain coins there and then. "I'll try and make you comfortable all I can," he remarked, as he put the coins in his pocket. Nevertheless, there was a doubtful intonation in his voice, which surprised me. Possibly his scale of fees had gone up, and he was not satisfied. But on the whole, I was inclined to think that, as he himself would have expressed it, he was the better for a glass. I was wrong, however, and did the man injustice. Nothing especially worthy of mention occurred during that day. We left the pier punctually, and it was very pleasant to be fairly under way, for the weather was warm and sultry, and the motion of the steamer produced a refreshing breeze. Everybody knows what the first day at sea is like. People pace the decks and stare at each other, and occasionally meet acquaintances whom they did not know to be on board. There is the usual uncertainty as to whether the food will be good, bad, or indifferent, until the first 2 meals have put the matter beyond a doubt. There is the usual uncertainty about the weather, until the ship is fairly off Fire Island. The tables are crowded at first, and then suddenly thinned. Pale-faced people spring from their seats and precipitate themselves towards the door, and each old sailor breathes more freely as his seasick neighbour rushes from his side, leaving him plenty of elbow room and an unlimited command over the mustard. One passage across the Atlantic is very much like another, and we, who cross very often, do not make the voyage for the sake of novelty. Whales and icebergs are indeed always objects of interest, but, after all, one whale is very much like another whale, and one rarely sees an iceberg at close quarters. To the majority of us, the most delightful moment of the day on board an ocean steamer is when we have taken our last turn on deck, have smoked our last cigar, and, having succeeded in tiring ourselves, feel at liberty to turn in with a clear conscience. On that first night of the voyage, I felt particularly lazy, and went to bed in 105 rather earlier than I usually do. As I turned in, I was amazed to see that I was to have a companion. A portmanteau, very like my own, lay in the opposite corner, and in the upper berth had been deposited a neatly folded rug with a stick and umbrella. I had hoped to be alone, and I was disappointed. But I wondered who my roommate was to be, and I determined to have a look at him. Before I had been long in bed, he entered. He was, as far as I could see, a very tall man, very thin, very pale, with sandy hair and whiskers, and colourless grey eyes. He had about him, I thought, an air of rather dubious fashion, the sort of man you might see in Wall Street, without being able precisely to say what he was doing there. The sort of man who frequents the Café Anglais, who always seems to be alone, and who drinks champagne. You might meet him on a racecourse, but he would never appear to be doing anything there, either. A little overdressed, a little odd. There are 3 or 4 of his kind on every ocean steamer. I made up my mind that I did not care to make his acquaintance, and I went to sleep, saying to myself that I would study his habits in order to avoid him. If he rose early, I would rise late. If he went to bed late, I would go to bed early. I did not care to know him. If you once know people of that kind, they are always turning up. Poor fellow! I need not have taken the trouble to come to so many decisions about him, for I never saw him again after that first night in 105. I was sleeping soundly when I was suddenly waked by a loud noise. To judge from the sound, my roommate must have sprung with a single leap from the upper berth to the floor. I heard him fumbling with the latch and bolt of the door, which opened almost immediately, and then I heard his footsteps as he ran at full speed down the passage, leaving the door open behind him. The ship was rolling a little, and I expected to hear him stumble or fall, but he ran as though he were running for his life. The door swung on its hinges with the motion of the vessel, and the sound annoyed me. I got up and shut it, and groped my way back to my berth in the darkness. I went to sleep again, but I have no idea how long I slept. When I awoke, it was still quite dark, but I felt a disagreeable sensation of cold, and it seemed to me that the air was damp. You know the peculiar smell of a cabin which has been wet with sea-water. I covered myself up as well as I could, and dozed off again, framing complaints to be made the next day, and selecting the most powerful epithets in the language. I could hear my roommate turn over in the upper berth. He had probably returned while I was asleep. Once I thought I heard him groan, and I argued that he was seasick. That is particularly unpleasant when one is below. Nevertheless, I dozed off and slept till early daylight. The ship was rolling heavily, much more than on the previous evening, and the grey light which came in through the porthole changed in tint with every movement, according as the angle of the vessel's side turned the glass seawards or skywards. It was very cold, unaccountably so for the month of June. I turned my head and looked at the porthole, and saw, to my surprise, that it was wide open and hooked back. I believe I swore audibly. Then I got up and shut it. As I turned back, I glanced at the upper berth. The curtains were drawn close together. My companion had probably felt cold as well as I. It struck me that I had slept enough. The stateroom was uncomfortable, though, strange to say, I could not smell the dampness which had annoyed me in the night. My roommate was still asleep. Excellent opportunity for avoiding him, so I dressed at once and went on deck. The day was warm and cloudy, with an oily smell on the water. It was 7 o'clock as I came out, much later than I had imagined. I came across the doctor, who was taking his first sniff of the morning air. He was a young man from the west of Ireland, a tremendous fellow, with black hair and blue eyes, already inclined to be stout. He had a happy-go-lucky, healthy look about him, which was rather attractive. "Fine morning," I remarked, by way of introduction. "Well," said he, eyeing me with an air of ready interest, "it's a fine morning, and it's not a fine morning. I don't think it's much of a morning." "Well, no, it is not so very fine," said I. "It's just what I call fugly weather," replied the doctor. "It was very cold last night, I thought," I remarked. "However, when I looked about, I found that the porthole was wide open. I had not noticed it when I went to bed, and the stateroom was damp, too." "Damp?" said he. "Whereabouts are you?" 105. To my surprise, the doctor started visibly, and stared at me. "What is the matter?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," he answered. "Only everybody has complained of that stateroom for the last 3 trips." "I shall complain too," I said. "It has certainly not been properly aired. It is a shame." "I don't believe it can be helped," answered the doctor. "I believe there is something— well, it is not my business to frighten passengers." "You need not be afraid of frightening me," I replied. "I can stand any amount of damp. If I should get a bad cold, I will come to you." I offered the doctor a cigar, which he took and examined very critically. "It is not so much the damp," he remarked. "However, I dare say you will get on very well. Have you a roommate?" "Yes, a deuce of a fellow, who bolts out in the middle of the night and leaves the door open." Again, the doctor glanced curiously at me. Then he lit the cigar and looked grave. "Did he come back?" he asked presently. "Yes, I was asleep, but I waked up and heard him moving. Then I felt cold and went to sleep again. This morning I found the porthole open." "Look here," said the doctor quietly. "I don't care much for this ship. I don't care a rap for her reputation. I tell you what I will do. I have a good-sized place up here. I will share it with you, though I don't know you from Adam." I was very much surprised at the proposition. I could not imagine why he should take such a sudden interest in my welfare. However, his manner, as he spoke of the ship, was peculiar. "You are very good, Doctor," I said, "but really, I believe even now the cabin could be aired, or cleaned out, or something. Why do you not care for the ship?" "We are not superstitious in our profession, sir," replied the doctor, "but the sea makes people so. I don't want to prejudice you, and I don't want to frighten you, but if you will take my advice, you will move in here. I would as soon see you overboard," he added, "as know that you, or any other man, was to sleep in 105. "Good gracious, why?" I asked. "Just because, on the last 3 trips, the people who have slept there actually have gone overboard," he answered gravely. The intelligence was startling, and exceedingly unpleasant, I confess. I looked hard at the doctor to see whether he was making game of me, but he looked perfectly serious. I thanked him warmly for his offer, but told him I intended to be the exception to the rule by which everyone who slept in that particular stateroom went overboard. He did not say much, but looked as grave as ever, and hinted that before we got across I should probably reconsider his proposal. In the course of time we went to breakfast, at which only an inconsiderable number of passengers assembled. I noticed that 1 or 2 of the officers who breakfasted with us looked grave. After breakfast I went into my stateroom in order to get a book. The curtains of the upper berth were still closely drawn. Not a word was to be heard. My roommate was probably still asleep. As I came out, I met the steward whose business it was to look after me. He whispered that the captain wanted to see me, and then scuttled away down the passage, as if very anxious to avoid any questions. I went towards the captain's cabin, and found him waiting for me. "Sir," said he, "I want to ask a favour of you." I answered that I would do anything to oblige him. "Your roommate has disappeared," he said. "He is known to have turned in early last night. Did you notice anything extraordinary in his manner?" The question coming, as it did, in exact confirmation of the fears the doctor had expressed half an hour earlier, staggered me. "You don't mean to say he has gone overboard?" I asked. "I fear he has," answered the captain. "This is the most extraordinary thing," I began. "Why?" he asked. "He is the 4th, then," I explained. In answer to another question from the captain, I explained, without mentioning the doctor, that I had heard the story concerning 105. He seemed very much annoyed at hearing that I knew of it. I told him what had occurred in the night. "What you say," he replied, "coincides almost exactly with what was told me by the roommates of 2 of the other 3. They bolt out of bed and run down the passage. 2 of them were seen to go overboard by the watch. We stopped and lowered boats, but they were not found. Nobody, however, saw or heard the man who was lost last night, if he really is lost. The steward, who is a superstitious fellow perhaps, and expected something to go wrong, went to look for him this morning and found his berth empty, but his clothes lying about, just as he had left them. The steward was the only man on board who knew him by sight, and he has been searching everywhere for him. He has disappeared. Now, sir, I want to beg you not to mention the circumstance to any of the passengers. I don't want the ship to get a bad name, and nothing hangs about an ocean-goer like stories of suicides. You shall have your choice of any one of the officers' cabins you like, including my own, for the rest of the passage. Is that a fair bargain?" "Oh, very," said I, "and I am much obliged to you. But since I am alone, and have the stateroom to myself, I would rather not move. If the steward will take out that unfortunate man's things, I would as lieve stay where I am. I will not say anything about the matter, and I think I can promise you that I will not follow my roommate." The captain tried to dissuade me from my intention, but I preferred having a stateroom alone to being the chum of any officer on board. I do not know whether I acted foolishly, but if I had taken his advice, I should have had nothing more to tell. There would have remained the disagreeable coincidence of several suicides occurring among men who had slept in the same cabin, but that would have been all. That was not the end of the matter, however, by any means. I obstinately made up my mind that I would not be disturbed by such tales, and I even went so far as to argue the question with the captain. There was something wrong about the stateroom, I said. It was rather damp. The porthole had been left open last night. My roommate might have been ill when he came on board, and he might have become delirious after he went to bed. He might even now be hiding somewhere on board, and might be found later. The place ought to be aired, and the fastening of the port looked to. If the captain would give me leave, I would see that what I thought necessary were done immediately. "Of course, you have a right to stay where you are, if you please," he replied, rather petulantly. "But I wish you would turn out and let me lock the place up and be done with it." I did not see it in the same light, and left the captain, after promising to be silent concerning the disappearance of my companion. The latter had had no acquaintances on board, and was not missed in the course of the day. Towards evening, I met the doctor again, and he asked me whether I had changed my mind. I told him I had not. "Then you will, before long," he said, very gravely. We played whist in the evening, and I went to bed late. I will confess now that I felt a disagreeable sensation when I entered my stateroom. I could not help thinking of the tall man I had seen on the previous night, who was now dead, drowned, tossing about in the long swell, 200 or 300 miles astern. His face rose very distinctly before me as I undressed, and I even went so far as to draw back the curtains of the upper berth, as though to persuade myself that he was actually gone. I also bolted the door of the stateroom. Suddenly, I became aware that the porthole was open and fastened back. This was more than I could stand. I hastily threw on my dressing-gown and went in search of Robert, the steward of my passage. I was very angry, I remember, and when I found him, I dragged him roughly to the door of 105 and pushed him towards the open porthole. "What the deuce do you mean, you scoundrel, by leaving that port open every night? Don't you know it is against the regulations? Don't you know that if the ship heeled and the water began to come in, 10 men could not shut it? I will report you to the captain, you blackguard, for endangering the ship." I was exceedingly wroth. The man trembled and turned pale, and then began to shut the round glass plate with the heavy brass fittings. "Why don't you answer me?" I said roughly. "If you please, sir," faltered Robert, "there's nobody on board as can keep this here port shut at night. You can try it yourself, sir. I ain't a-going to stop any longer on board this vessel, sir. I ain't indeed. But If I was you, sir, I'd just clear out and go and sleep with the surgeon or something, I would. Look here, sir. Is that fastened what you may call securely or not, sir? Try it, sir. See if it will move a hinge." I tried the port and found it perfectly tight. "Well, sir," continued Robert triumphantly, "I wager my reputation as a Hay-1 steward that in half an hour it will be open again. Fastened back, too, sir. That's the awful thing. Fastened back." I examined the great screw and the looped nut that ran on it. "If I find it open in the night, Robert, I will give you a sovereign. It is not possible. You may go." "Sovereign, did you say, sir? Very good, sir. Thank you, sir. Good night, sir. Pleasant repose, sir, and all manner of enchanting dreams, sir." Robert scuttled away, delighted at being released. Of course, I thought he was trying to account for his negligence by a silly story intended to frighten me, and I disbelieved him. The consequence was that he got his sovereign, and I spent a very peculiarly unpleasant night. I went to bed, and 5 minutes after I had rolled myself up in my blankets, the inexorable Robert extinguished the light that burned steadily behind the ground glass pane near the door. I lay quite still in the dark, trying to go to sleep, but I soon found that impossible. It had been some satisfaction to be angry with the steward, and the diversion had banished that unpleasant sensation I had at first experienced when I thought of the drowned man who had been my chum. But I was no longer sleepy, and I lay awake for some time, occasionally glancing at the porthole, which I could just see from where I lay, and which, in the darkness, looked like a faintly luminous soup plate suspended in blackness. I believe I must have lain there for an hour, and, as I remember, I was just dozing into sleep when I was roused by a draught of cold air, and by distinctly feeling the spray of the sea blown upon my face. I started to my feet, and, not having allowed in the dark for the motion of the ship, I was instantly thrown violently across the stateroom upon the couch which was placed beneath the porthole. I recovered myself immediately, however, and climbed upon my knees. The porthole was again wide open and fastened back. Now, these things are facts. I was wide awake when I got up, and I should certainly have been waked by the fall had I still been dozing. Moreover, I bruised my elbows and knees badly, and the bruises were there on the following morning to testify to the fact, if I myself had doubted it. The porthole was wide open and fastened back. A thing so unaccountable that I remember very well feeling astonishment rather than fear when I discovered it. I at once closed the plate again and screwed down the loop nut with all my strength. It was very dark in the stateroom. I reflected that the port had certainly been opened within an hour after Robert had at first shut it in my presence, and I determined to watch it and see whether it would open again. Those brass fittings are very heavy, and by no means easy to move. I could not believe that the clump had been turned by the shaking of the screw. I stood, peering out, through the thick glass at the alternate white and grey streaks of the sea that foamed beneath the ship's side. I must have remained there a quarter of an hour. Suddenly, as I stood, I distinctly heard something moving behind me in one of the berths, and a moment afterwards, just as I turned instinctively to look, though I could, of course, see nothing in the darkness, I heard a very faint groan. I sprang across the stateroom and tore the curtains of the upper berth aside, thrusting in my hands to discover if there were anyone there. There was someone. I remember that the sensation as I put my hands forward was as though I were plunging them into the air of a damp cellar, and from behind the curtain came a gust of wind, that smelled horribly of stagnant sea-water. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm, but was smooth and wet and icy cold. But suddenly, as I pulled, the creature sprang violently forward against me, a clammy, oozy mass, as it seemed to me, heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom, and in an instant the door opened and the thing rushed out. I had not had time to be frightened, and, quickly recovering myself, I sprang through the door and gave chase at the top of my speed. But I was too late. 10 yards before me I could see, I am sure I saw it, a dark shadow moving in the dimly lighted passage, quickly as the shadow of a fast horse thrown before a dog-cart by the lamp on a dark night. But in a moment it had disappeared, and I found myself holding on to the polished rail that ran along the bulkhead, where the passage turned towards the companion. My hair stood on end, and the cold perspiration rolled down my face. I am not ashamed of it in the least. I was very badly frightened. Still, I doubted my senses, and pulled myself together. It was absurd, I thought. The Welsh rabbit I had eaten had disagreed with me. I had been in a nightmare. I made my way back to my stateroom, and entered it with an effort. The whole place smelled of stagnant sea-water, as it had when I had waked on the previous evening. It required my utmost strength to go in and grope among my things for a box of wax lights. As I lighted a railway reading lantern, which I always carry in case I want to read after the lamps are out, I perceived that the porthole was again open, and a sort of creeping horror began to take possession of me, which I never felt before, nor wish to feel again. But I got a light, and proceeded to examine the upper berth, expecting to find it drenched with sea-water. But I was disappointed. The bed had been slept in, and the smell of the sea was strong, but the bedding was as dry as a bone. I fancied that Robert had not had the courage to make the bed after the accident of the previous night. It had all been a hideous dream. I drew the curtains back as far as I could, and examined the place very carefully. It was perfectly dry, but the porthole was open again. With a sort of dull bewilderment of horror, I closed it and screwed it down, and, thrusting my heavy stick through the brass loop, wrenched it with all my might, till the thick metal began to bend under the pressure. Then I hooked my reading lantern into the red velvet at the head of the couch, and sat down to recover my senses, if I could. I sat there all night, unable to think of rest, hardly able to think at all. But the porthole remained closed, and I did not believe it would now open again without the application of a considerable force. The morning dawned at last, and I dressed myself slowly, thinking over all that had happened in the night. It was a beautiful day, and I went on deck, glad to get out in the early, pure sunshine, and to smell the breeze from the blue water, so different from the noisome, stagnant odour from my stateroom. Instinctively I turned aft, towards the surgeon's cabin. There he stood, with a pipe in his mouth, taking his morning airing precisely as on the preceding day. "Good morning," said he, quietly, but looking at me with evident curiosity. "Doctor, you were quite right," said I. "There is something wrong about that place." "I thought you had changed your mind," he answered, rather triumphantly. "You have had a bad night, eh? Shall I make you a pick-me-up? I have a capital recipe." "No, thanks," I cried, "but I would like to tell you what happened." I then tried to explain as clearly as possible precisely what had occurred, not omitting to state that I had been scared, as I had never been scared in my whole life before. I dwelt particularly on the phenomenon of the porthole, which was a fact to which I could testify, even if the rest had been an illusion. I had closed it twice in the night, and the second time I had actually bent the brass in wrenching it with my stick. I believe I insisted a good deal on this point. "You seem to think I am likely to doubt the story," said the doctor, smiling at the detailed account of the state of the porthole. "I do not doubt it in the least. I renew my invitation to you. Bring your traps here, and take half my cabin." "Come and take half of mine for one night," I said. "Help me to get to the bottom of this thing." "You will get to the bottom of something else if you try," answered the doctor. "What?" I asked. "The bottom of the sea. I am going to leave the ship. It is not canny." "Then you will not help me to find out?" "Not I," said the doctor, quickly. "It is my business to keep my wits about me, not to go fiddling about with ghosts and things." "Do you really believe it is a ghost?" I inquired, rather contemptuously. But as I spoke, I remembered very well the horrible sensation of the supernatural which had got possession of me during the night. The doctor turned sharply on me. "Have you any reasonable explanation of these things to offer?" he asked. "No, you have not. Well, you say you will find an explanation. I say that you won't, sir, simply because there is not any." "But, my dear sir," I retorted, "do you, a man of science, mean to tell me that such things cannot be explained?" "I do," he answered, stoutly. "And if they could, I would not be concerned in the explanation." I did not care to spend another night alone in the stateroom, and yet I was obstinately determined to get at the root of the disturbances. I do not believe there are many men who would have slept there alone after passing 2 such nights, but I made up my mind to try it, if I could not get anyone to share a watch with me. The doctor was evidently not inclined for such an experiment. He said he was a surgeon, and that in case any accident occurred on board, he must always be in readiness. He could not afford to have his nerves unsettled. Perhaps he was quite right, but I am inclined to think that his precaution was prompted by his inclination. On inquiry, he informed me that there was no one on board who would be likely to join me in my investigations, and after a little more conversation, I left him. A little later, I met the captain and told him my story. I said that if no one would spend the night with me, I would ask leave to have the light burning all night, and would try it alone. "Look here," said he. "I will tell you what I will do. I will share your watch myself, and we will see what happens. It is my belief that we can find out between us. There may be some fellow skulking on board who steals a passage by frightening the passengers. It is just possible that there may be something queer in the carpentering of that berth." I suggested taking the ship's carpenter below and examining the place, but I was overjoyed at the captain's offer to spend the night with me. He accordingly sent for the workman and ordered him to do anything I required. We went below at once. I had all the bedding cleared out of the upper berth, and we examined the place thoroughly to see if there was a board loose anywhere, or a panel which could be opened or pushed aside. We tried the planks everywhere, tapped the flooring, unscrewed the fittings of the lower berth, and took it to pieces. In short, there was not a square inch of the stateroom which was not searched and tested. Everything was in perfect order, and we put everything back in its place. As we were finishing our work, Robert came to the door and looked in. "Well, sir, find anything, sir?" he asked, with a ghastly grin. "You were right about the porthole, Robert," I said, and I gave him the promised sovereign. The carpenter did his work silently and skilfully, following my directions. When he had done, he spoke. "I'm a plain man, sir," he said. But it's my belief you had better just turn out your things and let me run half a dozen 4-inch screws through the door of this cabin. There's no good never came of this cabin yet, sir, and that's all about it. There's been 4 lives lost out of here, to my own remembrance, and that in 4 trips. Better give it up, sir. Better give it up. I will try it for 1 night more, I said. Better give it up, sir. Better give it up. It's a precious bad job, repeated the workman, putting his tools in his bag and leaving the cabin. But my spirits had risen considerably at the prospect of having the captain's company, and I made up my mind not to be prevented from going to the end of the strange business. I abstained from Welsh rabbits and grog that evening, and did not even join in the customary game of whist. I wanted to be quite sure of my nerves, and my vanity made me anxious to make a good figure in the captain's eyes. The captain was one of those splendidly tough and cheerful specimens of seafaring humanity, whose combined courage, hardihood, and calmness in difficulty leads them naturally into high positions of trust. He was not the man to be led away by an idle tale, and the mere fact that he was willing to join me in the investigation was proof that he thought there was something seriously wrong, which could not be accounted for on ordinary theories, nor laughed down as a common superstition. To some extent, too, his reputation was at stake, as well as the reputation of the ship. It is no light thing to lose passengers overboard, and he knew it. About 10 o'clock that evening, as I was smoking a last cigar, he came up to me and drew me aside from the beat of the other passengers who were patrolling the deck in the warm darkness. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Brisbane," he said. "We must make up our minds either way, to be disappointed or to have a pretty rough time of it. You see, I cannot afford to laugh at the affair, and I will ask you to sign your name to a statement of whatever occurs. If nothing happens tonight, we will try it again tomorrow and next day. Are you ready?" So we went below and entered the stateroom. As we went in, I could see Robert, the steward, who stood a little further down the passage, watching us with his usual grin, as though certain that something dreadful was about to happen. The captain closed the door behind us and bolted it. "Supposing we put your portmanteau before the door," he suggested. "One of us can sit on it. Nothing can get out then. Is the port screwed down?" I found it as I had left it in the morning. Indeed, without using a lever, as I had done, no one could have opened it. I drew back the curtains of the upper berth, so that I could see well into it. By the captain's advice, I lighted my reading lantern and placed it so that it shone upon the white sheets above. He insisted upon sitting on the portmanteau, declaring that he wished to be able to swear that he had sat before the door. Then he requested me to search the stateroom thoroughly, an operation very soon accomplished, as it consisted merely in looking beneath the lower berth and under the couch below the porthole. The spaces were quite empty. "It is impossible for any human being to get in," I said, "or for any human being to open the port." "Very good," said the captain calmly. "If we see anything now, it must be either imagination or something supernatural." I sat down on the edge of the lower berth. "The first time it happened," said the captain, crossing his legs and leaning back against the door, "was in March. The passenger who slept here, in the upper berth, turned out to have been a lunatic. At all events, he was known to have been a little touched, and he had taken his passage without the knowledge of his friends. He rushed out in the middle of the night and threw himself overboard, before the officer who had the watch could stop him. We stopped and lowered a boat. It was a quiet night, just before that heavy weather came on, but we could not find him. Of course, his suicide was afterwards accounted for on the ground of his insanity." "I suppose that often happens," I remarked, rather absently. "Not often, no," said the captain. "Never before, in my experience, though I have heard of it happening on board of other ships. Well, as I was saying, that occurred in March. On the very next trip— What are you looking at?" he asked, stopping suddenly in his narration. I believe I gave no answer. My eyes were riveted upon the porthole. It seemed to me that the brass loop nut was beginning to turn very slowly upon the screw. So slowly, however, that I was not sure it moved at all. I watched it intently, fixing its position in my mind and trying to ascertain whether it changed. Seeing where I was looking, the captain looked too. "It moves!" he exclaimed, in a tone of conviction. "No, it does not," he added, after a minute. "If it were the jarring of the screw," said I, "it would have opened during the day, but I found it this evening jammed tight as I left it this morning." I rose and tried the nut. It was certainly loosened, for by an effort I could move it with my hands. "The queer thing," said the captain, "is that the second man who was lost is supposed to have got through that very port. We had a terrible time over it. It was in the middle of the night, and the weather was very heavy. There was an alarm that one of the ports was open, and the sea running in. I came below and found everything flooded, the water pouring in every time she rolled, and the whole port swinging from the top bolts, and not the porthole in the middle. Well, we managed to shut it, but the water did some damage. Ever since that, the place smells of seawater from time to time. We supposed the passenger had thrown himself out, though the Lord only knows how he did it. The steward kept telling me that he could not keep anything shut here. Upon my word, I can smell it now. Cannot you?" he inquired, sniffing the air suspiciously. "Yes, distinctly," I said, and I shuddered as that same odour of stagnant seawater grew stronger in the cabin. "Now, to smell like this, the place must be damp," I continued, "and yet when I examined it with the carpenter this morning, everything was perfectly dry. It is most extraordinary. Hello!" My reading lantern, which had been placed in the upper berth, was suddenly extinguished. There was still a good deal of light from the pane of ground glass near the door, behind which loomed the regulation lamp. The ship rolled heavily, and the curtain of the upper berth swung far out into the stateroom and back again. I rose quickly from my seat on the edge of the bed, and the captain at the same moment started to his feet with a loud cry of surprise. I had turned with the intention of taking down the lantern to examine it, when I heard his exclamation, and immediately afterwards his call for help. I sprang towards him. He was wrestling with all his might with the brass loop of the port. It seemed to turn against his hands in spite of all his efforts. I caught up my cane, a heavy oak stick I always used to carry, and thrust it through the ring and bore on it with all my strength. But the strong wood snapped suddenly, and I fell upon the couch. When I rose again, the port was wide open, and the captain was standing with his back against the door, pale to the lips. "There is something in that berth," he cried, in a strange voice, his eyes almost starting from his head. "Hold the door while I look. It shall not escape us, whatever it is." But instead of taking his place, I sprang upon the lower bed and seized something which lay in the upper berth. It was something ghostly, horrible beyond words, and it moved in my grip. It was like the body of a man long drowned, and yet it moved and had the strength of 10 men living. But I gripped it with all my might, the slippery, oozy, horrible thing. The dead white eyes seemed to stare at me out of the dusk. The putrid odour of rank seawater was about it. and its shiny hair hung in foul, wet curls over its dead face. I wrestled with the dead thing. It thrust itself upon me, and forced me back, and nearly broke my arms. It wound its corpse's arms about my neck, the living death, and overpowered me, so that I, at last, cried aloud and fell, and left my hold. As I fell, the thing sprang across me, and seemed to throw itself upon the captain. When I last saw him on his feet, his face was white and his lips set. It seemed to me that he struck a violent blow at the dead being, and then he, too, fell forward upon his face, with an inarticulate cry of horror. The thing paused an instant, seeming to hover over his prostrate body, and I could have screamed again for very fright, but I had no voice left. The thing vanished suddenly, and it seemed, to my disturbed senses, that it made its exit through the open port, though how that was possible, considering the smallness of the aperture, is more than anyone can tell. I lay a long time upon the floor, and the captain lay beside me. At last I partially recovered my senses, and moved, and I instantly knew that my arm was broken, the small bone of the left forearm near the wrist. I got upon my feet somehow, and with my remaining hand I tried to raise the captain. He groaned and moved, and at last came to himself. He was not hurt, but he seemed badly stunned. "Well, do you want to hear any more?" "There is nothing more. That is the end of my story. The carpenter carried out his scheme of running 6 4-inch screws through the door of 105, and if ever you take a passage in the Kamchatka, you may ask for a berth in that stateroom. You will be told that it is engaged. Yes, it is engaged by that dead thing." I finished the trip in the surgeon's cabin. He doctored my broken arm, and advised me not to fiddle about with ghosts and things any more. The captain was very silent, and never sailed again in that ship, though it is still running, and I will not sail in her either. It was a very disagreeable experience, and I was very badly frightened, which is a thing I do not like. That is all. That is how I saw a ghost. If it was a ghost. It was dead, anyhow. The Sand Walker by Fergus Hume. I make no endeavour to explain this experience. Explanation of it is impossible. I can conceive no theory upon which to base even the most slender attempt. It baffles me. It has always baffled me, and it will continue to baffle me. Yet the impress of the thing loses nothing of its vividness with time. It is as clear before me now as it was within a few hours of its event. I believe I heard a ghost knocking. I am certain I saw a ghost moving. Indigestion, fancy, an overwrought and distorted brain, you will say, no doubt. I wish I could think it was. But it wasn't. The sequel to that glimpse of the dead was too terrible. The cause too pertinent to the effect, to permit for one moment of any attribution to disorder, mental or alimentary. No. What I saw was actual, self-existent. I will set down the facts for you as they occurred, and you shall explain them away, if you can. Then, if you remain unconvinced, go to Gartholm by the German Ocean, and hear what the folk there have to say. They are a stodgy people, incapable utterly of the most insignificant hyperbole. They will tell you this tale plainly, as I tell it to you. They believe, as I believe. It was in the summer of '96. I was travelling in woollens for the great Huddersfield firm of Carberry and Crank. Furnished with a gig and a fast-trotting mare, it was my duty to exploit the more scattered parts of the country, where the railroad was still unknown, and civilization, as we use the term, tarried a while. Gartholm is the name given to a certain wide, low-lying plain, shut in from the North Sea by mile upon mile of sand-hills. They are heaped up like hummocks along the coast. It was along a kind of causeway, running straight through many miles of grain, that I drove that hot July. I had never been in these parts, and I rejoiced at such ample evidence of fertility. It argued prosperity for those around, hence good business for myself and my employers. I made up my mind to remain there for at least a month. I left in less than half that time. As if the plain itself were not sufficiently damp and low-lying, the village of Gartholm had been built in a kind of central depression, immediately beside the river. In other respects, it differed but slightly from the ordinary English village, save that there was no inn. Close by the tower of the rubble-built church, there was a pot-house, licensed for the sale of liquor to be drunk on the premises, but I failed there to get sleeping-room either for myself or Tilly, my weary mare. Darkness was close upon us, and I was worn out with my day's drive. There seemed little prospect of comfort, even had I gained admittance to this miserable hovel, but that was denied me. The landlord, a bulky, monumental lump of indolence, stood in the doorway and effectually blocked all entrance. A dozen or so of idlers collected to admire Tilly and amuse themselves at my expense, and I realized that there were worse fates than that of being cast upon an uninhabited island, even in this England of ours, at the close of the 19th century. While I was in this plight, arguing with the landlord, and endeavouring to arrive approximately at the sense of his dialect, a being, human by contrast to those around, made his appearance from out the crowd, and approached my gig. He turned out to be the village schoolmaster, and those around called him Muster Abram. "You are looking for a lodging?" he said, in a smooth and, by comparison, strangely civilized voice. "I am," I replied, soothing Tilly, who, small blame to her, in no wise appreciated her immediate surroundings. "I'm Dick Trussell, C.T. to Carberry and Crank, if you have ever heard of 'em in this forsaken hole." "C.T.?" repeated Master Abraham interrogatively, cocking his one eye, he had lost the other, which was as bright as any robin's. "Commercial traveller," said I, in explanation, "or bagman, if you like it better. You don't comprehend Queen's English, I see, in these parts." "Hardly, when so abbreviated. But if it really be board and lodging you seek, you can get that only from Mrs. Jarsill at Beech Farm." There was a murmur from those at hand as he said the name, and, I thought, a somewhat dubious expression upon the faces of one or two. I did not, on the whole, feel drawn towards Mrs. Jarsill and her farm, and I looked at the schoolmaster inquiringly. Utterly ignoring this, and vouchsafing me no reply, he proceeded straightway to climb into my gig, without so much as a "by your leave." There was neither modesty nor undue hesitancy about Master Abraham. "We will get on, then, to Mrs. Jarzill's farm," said I. A touch from the whip, and Tilly was off at a good spanking trot, in the direction Master Abraham had indicated. In a few moments we were out of sight of the hangers-on, and driving through the street into another causeway similar to the first. In the distance we could see the house lying under the lee of the sandhills. A dismal sort of place it seemed, and wholly solitary. "Yes, yonder is the beech farm," said the schoolmaster, "and Mrs. Jarzill—" He stopped suddenly, so that I turned to look at him. "What on earth is the matter with Mrs. Jarzill?" "Nothing. Nothing. I was merely wondering, not so much if she could, as whether she would, accommodate you. You see, Mrs. Jarzill had some trouble with her last lodger. He was a botanist. He called himself Amber, Samuel Amber. Some 2 years ago it was. He boarded at Beech Farm, then suddenly disappeared." "Disappeared? Good Lord, what do you mean?" "Exactly what I say. He walked out of yonder house one night, and never returned." We were close to the house now. It loomed up suddenly in the mist, which lay thick and heavy over the sandhills. I felt horribly depressed. Apart from the intense gloominess of the surroundings, the damp and darkness and desolation, all of which had perhaps more than their due effect upon my jaded nerves, I was conscious of an indefinite sense of uneasiness. This one-eyed creature at my elbow made me decidedly uncomfortable. I have not a robust nervous system at the best of times, and he, with his sinister innuendos, was fast gaining a hold upon me. "There was a daughter, you see," he went on, before I could speak. "Oh, there was a daughter, was there?" I repeated, somewhat relieved. It might be, after all, that he was nothing more than a mere scandal-monger. I fervently hoped so. "Yes, and Mr. Amber made love to her. At least, so it is supposed. At all events, she disappeared too." "At the same time as the man?" "Lottie was her name," continued Master Abraham, utterly heedless of my query. "And a pretty pink and white creature she was, with the loveliest golden hair. I used to call her Venus of the Fen. She was at the farm when Amber first arrived. After a while he left, and she with him. He did not return for a 12-month, and then only to disappear." "What on earth are you telling me all this rigmarole for? I don't care twopence for any of your Ambers and Lotties, or Venuses either, for that matter. If the girl was as pretty as you say, I don't blame the man for going off with her. I presume she was a willing party to the arrangement." "Mrs. Jarzill will have it that Amber forced her daughter to elope with him. You see, he returned a year later, alone." "Well, what explanation did he make?" "None whatever." "And what did the lady have to say to that?" "Nothing. Amber took up his residence at farm as before, and remained there until he disappeared." Upon my soul, I was beginning to feel thoroughly scared. "Do you mean to tell me that Mrs. Jarzill got rid of him by foul play?" "Oh, dear me, no. Nothing of the kind. Mrs. Jarzill is a most religious woman." "Then what the—" "Perhaps you will kindly make yourself clear. For what reason do you retail to me this parcel of rubbish?" "Only this." He laid his skinny hand upon my arm. We were turning into the drive which led up to the house. He pointed with the other hand towards the sand ridge. "Only what?" The man nodded. Then he whispered to me, "The sand-walker, you know." An elderly woman had come to the door, and was standing there. The chief thing I noticed about her was her determinedly masculine appearance. For the rest, She was a veritable study in half-tone. Her hair, her dress, her complexion, in fact, everything about her was of various shades of grey. Her mouth denoted a vile, if not a violent, temper. My reception was anything but cordial. In fact, at the outset, she refused altogether to take me in. But, under the persuasive eloquence of Master Abraham, she relented so far as to agree to board me by the week at what, to me, seemed an exorbitant charge. She was evidently grasping as well as religious, a highly unpleasant combination, I thought. But in the circumstances, I had no option but to accept the inevitable. It was a case of any port in a storm. As I proceeded to drive round to the stable to put up Tilly, a thing which I invariably attended to myself, Master Abraham accompanied me. And somehow I was glad of even his company. There was not a living soul about. I asked him why this was. "Mrs. Jarzill keeps no servants," he replied. "She's not kept any since Lottie and Mr. Amber went away. Or rather, to be precise, since Mr. Amber disappeared." "How is that?" "She can get none to come here, or to remain if they do come. They are afraid of the Sandwalker." I asked him point-blank what he meant, but I could get nothing out of him. "Whatever you do, don't go on to the beaches at dusk," was all he said. Then he vanished. I say vanished advisedly, for though I ran after him to the door, for the moment I could see no sign of him. I rushed on round the corner of the house, and came plump on to Mrs. Jarzill. "Master Abraham," I gasped. Then Mrs. Jarzill pointed down the road, and I saw a flying figure disappearing into the darkness. "Why does he run off like that?" I asked. I began to think I was losing my senses. "Everyone runs from Beech Farm," replied the woman, in the coolest manner possible, and with that she left me staring in amazement. I don't think anyone could dub me a coward, but this place unnerved me. Both within and without the house, all was mysterious, weird, and uncanny. My spirits sank to zero, and my nerves were strung up to a tension positively unendurable. Even the bright light from the kitchen fire filled me with apprehension. I could not touch food or drink. Mrs. Jarzill, gliding about the room, in no wise reassured me. Masculine and ponderous as she was, the deftness and stealthiness of her movements were uncomfortably incongruous. She spoke not a word. She totally ignored my presence. I began to loathe the woman, but I determined that anything was better than the horrible suspense I was enduring, so I went straight for the thing which was making havoc of me. "What is the Sandwalker, Mrs. Jarzill?" At the moment she was polishing a dish-cover. As I spoke, it crashed on the floor. I never saw a woman turn quite so pale as she did then. "Who has been talking to you about the Sandwalker?" "Master Abraham," was my answer. By this time she was visibly shaking. "Fool!" she exclaimed. "A triple fool, and dangerous too. See here, you Mr. Trussell, I'm willing to board you, but not to answer your silly questions. And if you don't like my arse and my ways, you can leave 'em both. I can do without you. God knows I've had enough of boarders." Though it was rash, and for all I knew dangerous, willy-nilly the name Amber slipped my tongue. But she had regained her self-possession now, and laughed contemptuously as she picked up the dish-cover. "I see Abraham's been telling him a story. 'Tis not a very pretty story, is it? Yes, Mr. Amber was a scoundrel. He carried off my daughter Lottie to London. Aye, and he had the boldness, too, to return here after his wickedness. I said nothing. It was my duty to forgive him, like a Christian. And I did. although a mother, I'm a Christian first. Poor Lottie. Poor child. I wonder where she is now. Do you know where Mr. Amber is? Yes, Abraham told you, no doubt, that he'd disappeared. One would think he had been caught up into the moon, the way the fools round here talk. Yet the explanation is perfectly simple. The man was accustomed to walk on the beaches at night. There are quicksands there, and he fell into one. How do you know that? I found his hat by one of the worst of 'em. He'd sunk. I'm glad he did. He ruined my life and Lottie's. But vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And this Sandwalker, what is it? That does not concern you. I've told you enough. I'm not going to answer all your silly questions, she reiterated. Not another word would she say. Still, I felt somewhat relieved. Abraham had contrived to surround with an atmosphere of mystery what, after all, was purely an accident. I saw that now, and I was able to go to bed in a much more tranquil state of mind than I would otherwise have done. My room was just off the kitchen. I hadn't been in it more than half an hour when I heard Mrs. Jarsill at her devotional exercises. I could hear her reading aloud certain biblical extracts of a uniformly comminatory character. Her voice was peculiarly resonant and booming. Her choice seemed to me to range from Deuteronomy to Ezekiel and back again. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed 'em up. They and all that appertained to 'em went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon 'em. The wicked are overthrown and are not. So for half an hour or more she went on, until I was in a cold perspiration. Then she knelt down and prayed. I was in hopes she had unbosomed herself for the night at all events, but then followed such a prayer as I have never heard. The ban of Jeremiah was a blessing to it. She cursed Amber, dead though he was. She cursed her daughter, and called down upon her unfortunate head such visitations that I confess I shuddered. The woman was raving. Yet all the time I could hear her sobbing bitterly. The whole thing was ghastly, revolting. I would have given anything to get away. At last she ceased, and, I presume, went to bed, though how she could sleep after such an indulgence was a marvel to me. But perhaps now that she had so assuaged her wrath, exhaustion, if not relief, would follow. I hoped so. At all events, she was quiet. After a while I got up, to make sure that my door was securely fastened. Then I scrambled back to bed, and fell into an uneasy, fitful doze. So I got through the long night. I never once slept soundly, and when I awoke in the morning, I felt but little refreshed. With the light came the sense of shame. I was inclined to deal severely with myself for my, as they now appeared to me, absurd apprehensions of the previous night. I made up my mind then and there that I should be a downright coward if I carried out my determination to leave the place. My room was comfortable, and the food was good, and I rated myself roundly for being such an impressionable booby. Besides, I knew enough to make me curious to know more. Albeit as silent as ever, I found Mrs. Jarsill civil and composed enough at breakfast. So, although I had not succeeded in getting rid wholly of my aversion to the place, I started off in quest of business, saying that I would return about 5 o'clock. I soon found out that so far as business went, at all events, I had fallen on my feet. The very excellent woollen goods of Messrs. Carberry and Crank appealed to these fen dwellers. They were a rheumatic lot. But that was more the fault of the locality than of themselves. At any rate, the local dealers seized upon my samples with avidity, and I booked more orders in the day than I was accustomed to do in a week in some places. I returned, therefore, that evening to the beach farm in the best of spirits. But at the gate I encountered Master Abraham. He soon reduced them to a normal level. "Well, how did you sleep?" he said, I thought with a twinkle in his eye. "Like a top, of course. I always do." "You heard nothing at your window?" "Of course not. What should I hear?" "Then you didn't go on to the beaches?" "Certainly not. I was only too glad to get to bed. Besides, were you not at particular pains to advise me against going there?" "Yes, perhaps I was, and I repeat my advice. If you do, it will come to you at the window." "What in heaven's name do you mean, man?" "I mean the sand-walker." At that moment Tilly made a bound forward. She hates standing, and there was nothing for it but to let her go. The schoolmaster took himself off, and I drove up to the door. But I silently swore at that skinny Abraham for bringing back to me the uneasy feelings of the previous night. His warning still rang in my ears. I could not get rid of it. I was determined I would not pass the night in ignorance. I resolved to take the bull by the horns and face whatever there was to face then and there. After a high tea, that was between 6 and 7 o'clock, I mentioned casually to Mrs. Jarsill that I was going for a stroll. She neither bade me go nor stay. So, over the sandhills at the back of the house, I scrambled until I found myself on the seashore. The beach was very dreary. All was still, save for the gentle swash of the wavelets breaking in upon the ribbed sand. There was but little wind. To right and left of me there stretched an interminable vista of sand, vanishing only to blend itself in the distance with the heavy mists, which, even at that season of the year, hung around. The little landlocked pools were blood-red with reflection of the sun. Though the offshore of the sea and sun were ablaze with crimson light, I felt an awful sense of desolation as I sat there in the dip of a sandhill, watching the departing sun ring its changes on the spectrum. The crimson merged to amethyst, the amethyst to pearl, until in sombre greyness the light shut down upon the lonely shore. A mad, purposeless impulse seized me. With a whoop, I ran down the firm sand to the brink of the water. I stood there for some moments, looking out to sea. When I turned, the mists were thick, even between me and the sandhills. Darkness came down fold over fold. Every moment the fog became more damp and clammy, the sense of desolation more intense. I was isolated from all that was human, from God, for aught I knew. Then I thought of the quicksands, of Mr. Amber, of Mr. Amber's hat found lying there, and I ran back, as I thought, to the sandhills. But I must have moved circuitously, for I could not reach even their friendly shelter. I lost my bearings hopelessly. Where the sea, or where the hills, I knew not. I rushed first this way and then that, heedless and without design, intent only on escaping from the enshrouding mists, from the awesome desolation. Suddenly the sands quaked under me. I stopped. The fate of Cora and his brethren flashed through my mind. My heart drummed loudly in the stillness. The mists grew thicker, the night darker. Then it was, I saw it beside me. At first, I thought it was mortal, a human, for its shape was that of a man. With an exclamation of thankfulness, I endeavoured to approach it. But try as I might, I could not get near it. It did not walk, it did not glide, it did not fly. It simply melted in the mist, yet always visible, always retreating. That was the horror of the thing. My flesh creeped. I felt an icy cold through every pore of my skin. With awful insistence it was borne in upon me. I was in the presence of the dead. Yet I was powerless. I could utter no cry. I could not even stop myself. On I went, following that melting, receding thing, until suddenly my foot stumbled on a sand hill. Then it became mist with the mist, and I saw it no more. I scrambled up the hill and wept like a child. How I reached the beach farm, I cannot tell. I stumbled, blind with terror, into the lamplight of the kitchen. I almost fell into Mrs. Jarzill's arms. She uttered no word of surprise, but sat there, staring at my terror-stricken face and quivering limbs, silent and unsympathetic. At last she spoke. "You've seen the Sandwalker?" "In God's name, what is it?" "God has nothing to do with the Sandwalker," she replied. "It is wholly of hell." I could speak no more that night. By help of some raw spirit, I managed to pull myself together sufficiently to scramble into bed. The very sheets were a comfort to me. At all events, they were between me and it. I was utterly exhausted, and for a few hours I slept. I awoke suddenly, with every nerve on the stretch, every sense acute, almost beyond bearing. Mrs. Jarzill was vociferating in the kitchen and sobbing between whiles. Then, as surely as I am a man and a Christian, I heard 3 loud knocks upon the window pane. Mrs. Jarzill turned her imprecations into prayer. In her deep voice she boomed out verses from the Psalms. "Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer." I could stand it no longer. I flung myself out of bed, wrapped the coverlet around me, and rushed into the kitchen. Mrs. Jarzill was kneeling, her face poured with perspiration. She paused as I appeared. There were 3 loud knocks at the door. "What? Oh, God, what is it?" I cried. "The Sandwalker." Then she prayed again. "I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the cover of thy wings." I made for the door, but Mrs. Jarzill seized me by the arm. "Don't let him in! Don't let him in! He wants me. It is Amber, I tell you. It is Amber." "Amber? The Sandwalker?" Yes, he is the Sandwalker. He wants me, down on beaches. If you open the door, I'm bound to go. He draws me, he compels me. But the Lord is my strength, and shall prevail against the powers of hell." I had to prevent her from unbarring the door. She flung herself upon it and fumbled with the lock in frenzy. I dragged her back, fearful lest she should admit the thing outside. Gradually she grew more calm, until at last she stood before me, with a composure almost as terrible to behold as had been her frenzy. "I have resisted the devil, and he is fled," she said. "You can go to bed now, Mr. Trussell. You will be disturbed no more. there will be no more knocking. No more knocking. She caught up the candle to go. I detained her till I took a light from it. Then I went to bed. I kept the light burning all night, but there was no more knocking. Next morning, not a word passed between us about what had occurred. I ate my breakfast and drove off to my business. In the main street, I met Abraham. I hailed him. "Is there no other place where I can find a lodging?" I asked him. "Ah, so you have been on the beaches." "Yes, I was there yesterday evening." "You have seen the Sandwalker?" "For God's sake, don't speak of it," I said, for it terrified me, even in the open day, here with the sunshine hot upon me. "And you have heard the knocking?" "Yes, I have heard everything, seen everything. Let that suffice. Can I find another lodging, I ask you?" "No, there is none other in the district. But why need you fear? It is she, not you, the Sandwalker wants. Aye, and he'll get her one night." "You know this Sandwalker, as you call him, is Amber?" "All Gartholm knows that. He has been walking for a year past now, on the beaches. No one would go there now for any money you could offer them, at least not after sundown. I warned you, you remember." "I know you did, but nevertheless I went, you see. And this Sandwalker saved my life, for he led me back to the sandhills when I had lost myself hopelessly in the fog." "It's not you he wants, I tell you. It's she." "Why does he want her?" I asked. The man's tone was very strange. "Ask of the quicksands," he replied, and with that disappeared in a hurry. I was getting quite accustomed to this, and would have been surprised had he taken his leave in anything approaching a rational manner. Now, you may perhaps hardly credit it, but I tossed a shilling, then and there, to decide my action in the immediate future. Heads I go, tails I stay. The coin spun up in the sunlight. Tails it was. So I was to remain, and in that devil-haunted house. Well, at all events, I was doing a brisk trade. There was some comfort in that. During the next 10 days I drove for miles over the district, and did uncommonly well everywhere. I found that the legend of the beach farm was universally familiar, and they all shook their heads very gravely indeed when they learned that I lodged there. In fact, I'm not at all sure that this was not of assistance to me, rather than otherwise. I became an object of intense interest, and, no doubt, of sympathy, had I known it. After that terrible night, there was a lull in the torment of the Sandwalker. Occasionally it rapped at the door or the window, but that was all. As for me, I walked no more on the beaches. But the time was near at hand when the devil would have his own. It came one evening about 6 o'clock. There had been heavy rain, and the marshy lands were flooded, and the mists were thick around. Overhead all was opaque and grey, and the ground was sodden underfoot. I was anxious to get home, and Tilly was doing all she knew. On arrival, I looked after her, as was my wont, first and foremost. When I had made her comfortable for the night, I returned to the kitchen. To my surprise, I found Mrs. Jarsill in conversation with a girl, in whom, from Abraham's description, meagre though it had been, I had no difficulty in recognizing his Venus of the Fen. She was certainly pretty. I agreed with Abraham there. She was crying bitterly, whilst her mother raged at her. They both stopped short as I entered, a sense of delicacy, no doubt. "Whatever is the matter?" I asked, surveying the pair of them. "Oh, sir, you are mother's new lodger, aren't you?" said the girl. "Master Abraham told me she had one. Do please ask her to hear reason. Do, I implore you, sir." "I will allow no one to interfere with my private affairs," said Mrs. Jarzill, stamping her foot. "If you are wise, you will not seek to make public your disgrace." "There is no disgrace. I've done nothing to be ashamed of, I tell you." No disgrace in allowing yourself to be beguiled by that man, to be fooled by his good looks and soft speeches." "What do you mean, mother? I have nothing to do with Mr. Amber." "Liar! You ran away with him. What more could you have to do with him, I should like to know?" Lottie's spirit rose, and with it the colour to her cheeks. "I ran away with him? Indeed, I did nothing of the kind. It was you who made me run away. You treated me so cruelly that I determined to go into service in London. I was sick to death of your scolding, and your preaching and praying, and this dismal house, and those horrible mists, and never a soul to speak to. Sick to death of it, I tell you. That's why I went. Mr. Amber, indeed." This with a toss of her head. "I have more taste than to take up with the likes of him. I met him as he was leaving here. I was walking, and he offered me a lift." Abraham saw you both," interrupted her mother savagely. "He told me you had eloped with the man." "That was a lie. I parted from Mr. Amber at London railway station. From that time to this I've never set eyes upon him. For my own sake I made him promise to hold his tongue." He did, cried Mrs. Jarzill wildly. "God help him, and me, he did. He returned here, but he said nothing, made no explanation. I believed he had ruined you. Now, I see it all, and you have ruined me." "Oh, Mother, what do you mean?" "Why did you not let him speak? Oh, why did you not write and explain? I thought he had robbed me of you, and I revenged myself upon him." "Revenged yourself?" I cried. I began to have an inkling of what was coming. But Mrs. Jarzill paid no heed to me. She shook Lottie furiously. "Do you know what your silence has cost me?" She was beside herself now. "It has cost me my soul. My soul, I say. Oh, why did you let me believe him guilty? I killed him. I murdered him for your sake. It was not vengeance, it was not justice. It was crime and evil." "You killed Mr. Amber?" "Yes, I killed him. I swore he should pay for what he'd done. His own curiosity did for him. I played upon it. I lured him to the quicksands." "The quicksands?" I repeated, horrified. "I placed a lantern on the brink of the most dangerous of them," the woman continued feverishly. "He used habitually to walk on the beaches at dark. His curiosity did the rest. He had to see what that light was. I knew he would. It was the last light he ever saw in this world. Yes, you call it murder. It was murder. But it was your fault. Your fault. And now he walks and taps at door for me. He wants me. He wants me. I thought I had justice on my side, that I was avenging your disgrace, and I fought with my soul. Oh, how I fought! But now I see he is right. It is I who must now be punished. I must go. I must go. Oh, God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Lottie lay stretched on the floor. She had fainted. I placed myself between her mother and the door. I dared not let her out. "Where would you go?" I cried, seizing her by the arm, and frustrating a desperate effort to get away. She was fairly demented, and seemed possessed of strength almost demoniacal. "To the beaches, to me death. Let me go. Let me go! An eye for an eye, I say, a tooth for a tooth. That is the law of God. Hark! Listen! He calls! He calls me!" I could hear nothing but the howling of the wind. "I must go! I must go! I must—" She was too quick for me. Before I had time to stop her, she was away into the desolate night. I rushed after her. In her present condition there was no knowing what she might do. Clearly her mind was unhinged. I could hardly see for the rain. It was nearly dark, too. But on through the mire and the mist I went. I jostled up against a man. It was Abraham. I remembered it was he who had caused all this, and with the thought I lost control of myself. I gripped him by the throat. "You dog! You liar! Lottie, the girl, has come back." I know," he gasped. "I was coming up to see her. Leave me alone. What do you mean by this?" "You deserve it, and more, you villain. You know well the girl did not go with Amber. You lied to her mother. You made her think so. You were in love with her yourself. The man's death lies at your door more than at hers. She has gone to the beaches. To her death, I tell you, unless she has stopped." Then I realized that I was wasting time. I hastened on, regretting deeply that my feelings had so got the better of me just then. It was blowing half a gale, though it was not till I had crossed the sand hills that I realized it. Then the full blast of the wind struck me. It was as much as I could do to keep my feet. I could not see the woman anywhere, though I peered into the gloom until my head swam. Not a sign of her, or any living creature could I see. There was nothing but the roar of the wind and the sea, and the swish of the driving rain. Then I thought I heard a cry, a faint cry. I ploughed my way down in the direction whence I fancied it came. I became aware that Abraham had followed me. He was close behind me. Together we groped blindly on. "He'll get her this time," shouted the man. "Come on! Come on!" I roared at him. "Yonder she is." "And yonder the sandwalker." The wretch hung back. Then a gust of wind, more concentrated and more fierce than before, seemed to rend an opening in the fog. 2 shadows could be seen fluttering along. One, a man of unusual height, the other a woman, reeling and swaying. She followed the thing. As we gazed, a light appeared in the distance, radiant as a star. Its brilliance grew, and spread far and wide through the fog. The tall figure moved up to and past the light, the other following, always following. She staggered and flung up her arms, and a wild and despairing cry rang out above the elements, and the light gradually died away, and the wind howled on, driving the mists across the sinking figure. Slowly she sank into the sand, deeper and deeper. One last terrible moan reached us where we were. Then she disappeared. For the moment, the storm seemed to hush. Then all was darkness. Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance by M.R. James. About 15 years ago, on a date late in August or early in September, a train drew up at Wilsthorpe, a country station in eastern England. Out of it stepped, with other passengers, a rather tall and reasonably good-looking young man, carrying a handbag and some papers tied up in a packet. He was expecting to be met, one would say, from the way in which he looked about him, and he was, as obviously, expected. The station-master ran forward a step or two, and then, seeming to recollect himself, turned and beckoned to a stout and consequential person with a short round beard, who was scanning the train with some appearance of bewilderment. "Mr. Cooper," he called out. "Mr. Cooper, I think this is your gentleman." And then to the passenger who had just alighted, "Mr. Humphreys, sir. Glad to bid you welcome to Wilsthorpe. There's a cart from the hall for your luggage, and here's Mr. Cooper, what I think you know." Mr. Cooper had hurried up, and now raised his hat and shook hands. "Very pleased, I'm sure," he said, "to give the echo to Mr. Palmer's kind words. I should have been the first to render expression to them, but for the face not being familiar to me, Mr. Humphreys. May your residence among us be marked as a red-letter day, sir." "Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper," said Humphreys, "for your good wishes, and Mr. Palmer also. I do hope very much that this change of tenancy, which you must all regret, I am sure, will not be to the detriment of those with whom I shall be brought in contact." He stopped, feeling that the words were not fitting themselves together in the happiest way, and Mr. Cooper cut in. "Oh, you may rest satisfied of that, Mr. Humphreys. I'll take it upon myself to assure you, sir, that a warm welcome awaits you on all sides. And as to any change of propriety turning out detrimental to the neighbourhood, well, your late uncle—" And here Mr. Cooper also stopped, possibly in obedience to an inner monitor, possibly because Mr. Palmer, clearing his throat loudly, asked Humphreys for his ticket. The two men left the little station, and, at Humphreys' suggestion, decided to walk to Mr. Cooper's house, where luncheon was awaiting them. The relation in which these personages stood to each other can be explained in a very few lines. Humphreys had inherited, quite unexpectedly, a property from an uncle. Neither the property nor the uncle had he ever seen. He was alone in the world, a man of good ability and kindly nature, whose employment in a government office for the last 4 or 5 years had not gone far to fit him for the life of a country gentleman. He was studious and rather diffident, and had few out-of-door pursuits except golf and gardening. Today he had come down for the first time to visit Wilsthorpe, and confer with Mr. Cooper, the bailiff, as to the matters which needed immediate attention. It may be asked how this came to be his first visit. Ought he not in decency to have attended his uncle's funeral? The answer is not far to seek. He had been abroad at the time of the death, and his address had not been at once procurable. So he had put off coming to Wilsthorpe till he heard that all things were ready for him. And now we find him arrived at Mr. Cooper's comfortable house facing the parsonage, and having just shaken hands with the smiling Mrs. and Miss Cooper. During the minutes that preceded the announcement of luncheon, the party settled themselves on elaborate chairs in the drawing-room, Humphreys, for his part, perspiring quietly in the consciousness that stock was being taken of him. "I was just saying to Mr. Humphreys, my dear," said Mr. Cooper, "that I hope and trust that his residence among us here in Wilsthorpe will be marked as a red-letter day." "Yes, indeed, I'm sure," said Mrs. Cooper heartily, "and many, many of them." Miss Cooper murmured words to the same effect, and Humphreys attempted a pleasantry about painting the whole calendar red, which, though greeted with shrill laughter, was evidently not fully understood. At this point they proceeded to luncheon. "Do you know this part of the country at all, Mr. Humphreys?" said Mrs. Cooper after a short interval. This was a better opening. "No, I'm sorry to say I do not," said Humphreys. "It seems very pleasant, what I could see of it coming down in the train." "Oh, it is a pleasant part. Really, I sometimes say I don't know a nicer district for the country. And the people round, too. Such a quantity always going on. but I'm afraid you've come a little late for some of the better garden parties, Mr. Humphreys." "I suppose I have. Dear me, what a pity," said Humphreys, with a gleam of relief. And then, feeling that something more could be got out of this topic, "But after all, you see, Mrs. Cooper, even if I could have been here earlier, I should have been cut off from them, should I not? My poor uncle's recent death, you know." "Oh, dear, Mr. Humphreys, to be sure. What a dreadful thing of me to say." And Mr. and Miss Cooper seconded the proposition inarticulately. "What must you have thought? I am sorry. You must really forgive me." "Not at all, Mrs. Cooper, I assure you. I can't honestly assert that my uncle's death was a great grief to me, for I had never seen him. All I meant was that I supposed I shouldn't be expected to take part for some little time in festivities of that kind." "Now, really, it's very kind of you to take it in that way, Mr. Humphreys, isn't it, George? And you do forgive me. But only fancy, you never saw poor old Mr. Wilson." "Never in my life. Nor did I ever have a letter from him. But, by the way, you have something to forgive me for. I've never thanked you, except by letter, for all the trouble you've taken to find people to look after me at the Hall." "Oh, I'm sure that was nothing, Mr. Humphreys. But I really do think that you'll find them give satisfaction. The man and his wife, whom we've got for the butler and housekeeper, we've known for a number of years. Such a nice, respectable couple. And Mr. Cooper, I'm sure, can answer for the men in the stables and gardens." "Yes, Mr. Humphreys, they're a good lot. The head gardener's the only one who's stopped on from Mr. Wilson's time. The major part of the employees, as you no doubt saw by the will, received legacies from the old gentleman and retired from their posts. And as the wife says, your housekeeper and butler are calculated to render you every satisfaction." "So everything, Mr. Humphreys, is ready for you to step in this very day, according to what I understood you to wish," said Mrs. Cooper. "Everything, that is, except company, and there I'm afraid you'll find yourself quite at a standstill. Only we did understand it was your intention to move in at once. If not, I'm sure you know we should have been only too pleased for you to stay here." "I'm quite sure you would, Mrs. Cooper, and I'm very grateful to you, but I thought I had really better make the plunge at once. I am accustomed to living alone, and there will be quite enough to occupy my evenings, looking over papers and books and so on, for some time to come. I thought if Mr. Cooper could spare the time this afternoon to go over the house and grounds with me—" "Certainly, certainly, Mr. Humphreys. My time is your own, up to any hour you please." "Till dinner-time, father, you mean?" said Miss Cooper. "Don't forget we're going over to the Brasnets. And have you got all the garden keys?" "Are you a great gardener, Miss Cooper?" said Mr. Humphreys. "I wish you would tell me what I'm to expect at the Hall." "Oh, I don't know about a great gardener, Mr. Humphreys. I'm very fond of flowers. But the Hall garden might be made quite lovely, I often say. It's very old-fashioned as it is, and a great deal of shrubbery. There's an old temple besides, and a maze." "Really? Have you explored it ever?" "No," said Miss Cooper, drawing in her lips and shaking her head. "I've often longed to try, but old Mr. Wilson always kept it locked. He wouldn't even let Lady Wardrop into it. She lives near here, at Bentley, you know, and she's a great gardener, if you like. That's why I asked father if he had all the keys." "I see. Well, I must evidently look into that, and show you over it when I've learnt the way." "Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Humphreys. Now I shall have the laugh of Miss Foster. That's our rector's daughter, you know. They're away on their holiday now. Such nice people. We always had a joke between us which should be the first to get into the maze." "I think the garden keys must be up at the house," said Mr. Cooper, who had been looking over a large bunch. "There is a number there in the library. Now, Mr. Humphreys, if you're prepared, we might bid good-bye to these ladies and set forward on our little tour of exploration." As they came out of Mr. Cooper's front gate, Humphreys had to run the gauntlet, not of an organised demonstration, but of a good deal of touching of hats and careful contemplation from the men and women who had gathered in somewhat unusual numbers in the village street. He had further to exchange some remarks with the wife of the lodge-keeper as they passed the park gates, and with the lodge-keeper himself, who was attending to the park road. I cannot, however, spare the time to report the progress fully. As they traversed the half-mile or so between the lodge and the house, Humphreys took occasion to ask his companion some question which brought up the topic of his late uncle, and it did not take long before Mr. Cooper was embarked upon a disquisition. "It is singular to think, as the wife was saying just now, that you should never have seen the old gentleman, and yet you won't misunderstand me, Mr. Humphreys, I feel confident, when I say that in my opinion there would have been but little congeniality betwixt yourself and him. Not that I have a word to say in deprecation, not a single word. I can tell you what he was," said Mr. Cooper, pulling up suddenly and fixing Humphreys with his eye. "Can tell you what he was in a nutshell, as the saying goes. He was a complete, thorough valetudinarian. That describes him to a T. That's what he was, sir, a complete valetudinarian. No participation in what went on around him. I did venture, I think, to send you a few words of cutting from our local paper, which I took the occasion to contribute on his decease. If I recollect myself aright, such is very much the gist of them. But don't, Mr. Humphreys," continued Cooper, tapping him impressively on the chest. "Don't you run away with the impression that I wish to say aught but what is most creditable, of your respected uncle and my late employer. Upright, Mr. Humphreys, open as the day, liberal to all in his dealings. He had the heart to feel and the hand to accommodate. But there it was. There was the stumbling block, his unfortunate health, or, as I might more truly phrase it, his want of health." "Yes, poor man. Did he suffer from any special disorder before his last illness, which I take it was little more than old age?" "Just that, Mr. Humphreys, just that. The flash flickering slowly away in the pan," said Cooper, with what he considered an appropriate gesture. "The golden bowl gradually ceasing to vibrate. But as to your other question, I should return a negative answer. General absence of vitality? Yes. Special complaint? No, unless you reckon a nasty cough he had with him. Why, here we are pretty much at the house. A handsome mansion, Mr. Humphreys, don't you consider?" It deserved the epithet, on the whole, but it was oddly proportioned. A very tall, red-brick house, with a plain parapet concealing the roof almost entirely. It gave the impression of a town house set down in the country. There was a basement, and a rather imposing flight of steps leading up to the front door. It seemed also, owing to its height, to desiderate wings, but there were none. The stables and other offices were concealed by trees. Humphreys guessed its probable date as 1770, or thereabouts. The mature couple who had been engaged to act as butler and cook-housekeeper were waiting inside the front door, and opened it as their new master approached. Their name, Humphreys already knew, was Carlton. Of their appearance and manner he formed a favourable impression in the few minutes' talk he had with them. It was agreed that he should go through the plate and the cellar next day with Mr. Carlton, and that Mrs. C. should have a talk with him about linen, bedding, and so on, what there was and what there ought to be. Then he and Cooper, dismissing the Carltons for the present, began their view of the house. Its topography is not of importance to this story. The large rooms on the ground floor were satisfactory, especially the library, which was as large as the dining-room, and had 3 tall windows facing east. The bedroom prepared for Humphreys was immediately above it. There were many pleasant, and a few really interesting, old pictures. None of the furniture was new, and hardly any of the books were later than the 70s. After hearing of and seeing the few changes his uncle had made in the house, and contemplating a shiny portrait of him which adorned the drawing-room, Humphreys was forced to agree with Cooper that in all probability there would have been little to attract him in his predecessor. It made him rather sad that he could not be sorry. Dolebat se dolere non posse, for the man who, whether with or without some feeling of kindliness towards his unknown nephew, had contributed so much to his well-being. For he felt that Wilsthorpe was a place in which he could be happy, and especially happy, it might be, in its library. And now it was time to go over the garden. The empty stables could wait, and so could the laundry. So to the garden they addressed themselves, and it was soon evident that Miss Cooper had been right in thinking that there were possibilities. Also that Mr. Cooper had done well in keeping on the gardener. The deceased Mr. Wilson might not have, indeed plainly had not, been imbued with the latest views on gardening. But whatever had been done here had been done under the eye of a knowledgeable man, and the equipment and stock were excellent. Cooper was delighted with the pleasure Humphreys showed, and with the suggestions he let fall from time to time. "I can see," he said, "that you've found your meteor here, Mr. Humphreys. You'll make this place a regular sign of seer before very many seasons have passed over our heads. I wish Clutterham had been here. That's the head gardener. And here he would have been, of course, as I told you, but for his son's being horse-dover with a fever, poor fellow. I should like him to have heard how the place strikes you." "Yes, you told me he couldn't be here today, and I was very sorry to hear the reason. But it will be time enough tomorrow. What is that white building on the mound at the end of the grass ride? Is it the temple Miss Cooper mentioned?" "That is it, Mr. Humphreys. The Temple of Friendship. Constructed of marble, brought out of Italy for the purpose, by your late uncle's grandfather. Would it interest you, perhaps, to take a turn there? You'll get a very sweet prospect of the park." The general lines of the temple were those of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli, helped out by a dome, only the whole was a good deal smaller. Some ancient sepulchral reliefs were built into the wall, and about it all was a pleasant flavour of the grand tour. Cooper produced the key, and with some difficulty opened the heavy door. Inside there was a handsome ceiling, but little furniture. Most of the floor was occupied by a pile of thick, circular blocks of stone, each of which had a single letter deeply cut on its slightly convex upper surface. "What is the meaning of these?" Humphreys inquired. "Meaning? Well, all things, we're told, have their purpose, Mr. Humphreys, and I suppose these blocks have had theirs as well as another. But what that purpose is or was—" Mr. Cooper assumed a didactic attitude here. "I, for one, should be at a loss to point out to you, sir. All I know of them, and it's summed up in a very few words, is just this, that they're stated to have been removed by your late uncle, at a period before I entered on the scene, from the maze. That, Mr. Humphreys, is—" "Oh, the maze!" exclaimed Humphreys. "I'd forgotten that. We must have a look at it. Where is it?" Cooper drew him to the door of the temple, and pointed with his stick. "Guide your eye," he said, somewhat in the manner of the second elder in Handel's Susanna. "Far to the west direct your straining eyes, where yon tall holm tree rises to the skies. Guide your eye by my stick here, and follow out the line directly opposite to the spot where we're standing now, and I'll engage, Mr. Humphreys, that you'll catch the archway over the entrance. You'll see it just at the end of the walk, answering to the one that leads up to this very building. Did you think of going there at once? Because if that be the case, I must go to the house and procure the key. If you would walk on there, I'll rejoin you in a few moments' time." Accordingly, Humphreys strolled down the ride leading to the temple, past the garden front of the house, and up the turfy approach to the archway which Cooper had pointed out to him. He was surprised to find that the whole maze was surrounded by a high wall, and that the archway was provided with a padlocked iron gate. But then he remembered that Miss Cooper had spoken of his uncle's objection to letting anyone enter this part of the garden. He was now at the gate, and still Cooper came not. For a few minutes he occupied himself in reading the motto cut over the entrance, "Secretum meum mihi et filius domus miei," and in trying to recollect the source of it. Then he became impatient, and considered the possibility of scaling the wall. This was clearly not worthwhile. It might have been done if he had been wearing an older suit. Or could the padlock, a very old one, be forced? No, apparently not. And yet, as he gave a final, irritated kick at the gate, something gave way, and the lock fell at his feet. He pushed the gate open, inconveniencing a number of nettles as he did so, and stepped into the enclosure. It was a yew maze of circular form, and the hedges, long untrimmed, had grown out and upwards to a most unorthodox breadth and height. The walks, too, were next door to impassable. Only by entirely disregarding scratches, nettle stings, and wet could Humphreys force his way along them. But, at any rate, this condition of things, he reflected, would make it easier for him to find his way out again, for he left a very visible track. So far as he could remember, he had never been in a maze before, nor did it seem to him now that he had missed much. The dankness and darkness and smell of crushed goosegrass and nettles were anything but cheerful. Still, it did not seem to be a very intricate specimen of its kind. Here he was. By the way, was that Cooper arrived at last? No. Very nearly at the heart of it, without having taken too much thought as to what path he was following. Ah, there at last was the centre, easily gained. And there was something to reward him. His first impression was that the central ornament was a sundial, but when he had switched away some portion of the thick growth of brambles and bindweed that had formed over it, he saw that it was a less ordinary decoration. A stone column about 4 feet high, and on the top of it a metal globe, copper, to judge by the green patina, engraved, and finely engraved too, with figures in outline and letters. That was what Humphreys saw, and a brief glance at the figures convinced him that it was one of those mysterious things called celestial globes, from which, one would suppose, no one ever yet derived any information about the heavens. However, it was too dark, at least in the maze, for him to examine this curiosity at all closely, and besides, he now heard Cooper's voice, and sounds as of an elephant in the jungle. Humphreys called to him to follow the track he had beaten out, and soon Cooper emerged panting into the central circle. He was full of apologies for his delay. He had not been able, after all, to find the key. "But there," he said, "you've penetrated into the heart of the mystery, unaided and unannealed, as the saying goes. Well, I suppose it's a matter of 30 to 40 years since any human foot has trod these precincts. Certain it is that I've never set foot in them before. Well, what's the old proverb about angels fearing to tread? It's proved true once again in this case." Humphrey's acquaintance with Cooper, though it had been short, was sufficient to assure him that there was no guile in this allusion, and he forbore the obvious remark, merely suggesting that it was fully time to get back to the house for a late cup of tea, and to release Cooper for his evening engagement. They left the maze accordingly, experiencing well nigh the same ease in retracing their path as they had in coming in. "Have you any idea," Humphreys asked, as they went towards the house, "why my uncle kept that place so carefully locked?" Cooper pulled up, and Humphreys felt that he must be on the brink of a revelation. "I should merely be deceiving you, Mr. Humphreys, and that to no good purpose, if I laid claim to possess any information whatsoever on that topic. When I first entered upon my duties here, some 18 years back, that maze was, word for word, in the condition you see it now, and the one and only occasion on which the question ever arose within my knowledge was that of which my girl made mention in your hearing. Lady Wardrop, I've not a word to say against her, wrote applying for admission to the maze. Your uncle showed me the note, a most civil note, everything that could be expected from such a quarter. 'Cooper,' he said, 'I wish you'd reply to that note on my behalf.' 'Certainly, Mr. Wilson,' I said, for I was quite inured to acting as his secretary. What answer shall I return to it? Well, he said, give Lady Wardrop my compliments, and tell her that if ever that portion of the grounds is taken in hand, I shall be happy to give her the first opportunity of viewing it, but that it has been shut up now for a number of years, and I shall be grateful to her if she kindly won't press the matter. That, Mr. Humphreys, was your good uncle's last word on the subject, and I don't think I can add anything to it. Unless, added Cooper, after a pause, it might be just this, that, so far as I could form a judgment, he had a dislike, as people often will, for one reason or another, to the memory of his grandfather, who, as I mentioned to you, had that maze laid out. A man of peculiar tenets, Mr. Humphreys, and a great traveller. You'll have the opportunity, on the coming Sabbath, of seeing the tablet to him in our little parish church. Put up, it was, some long time after his death. Oh, I should have expected a man who had such a taste for building to have designed a mausoleum for himself. Well, I've never noticed anything of the kind you mention, and, in fact, come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that his resting-place is within our boundaries at all. That he lays in the vault, I'm pretty confident is not the case. Curious, now, that I shouldn't be in a position to inform you on that heading. Still, after all, we can't say, can we, Mr. Humphreys, that it's a point of crucial importance where the poor mortal coils are bestowed? At this point they entered the house, and Cooper's speculations were interrupted. Tea was laid in the library, where Mr. Cooper fell upon subjects appropriate to the scene. A fine collection of books, one of the finest, I've understood from connoisseurs, in this part of the country. Splendid plates, too, in some of these works. I recollect your uncle showing me one with views of foreign towns. Most absorbing it was, got up in first-rate style. And another all done by hand, with the ink as fresh as if it had been laid on yesterday, and yet, he told me, it was the work of some old monk, hundreds of years back. I've always taken a keen interest in literature myself. Hardly anything, to my mind, can compare with a good hour's reading after a hard day's work. Far better than wasting the whole evening at a friend's house. Oh, and that reminds me, to be sure, I shall be getting into trouble with the wife if I don't make the best of my way home, and get ready to squander away one of these same evenings. I must be off, Mr. Humphreys. And that reminds me, said Humphreys. If I'm to show Miss Cooper the maze tomorrow, we must have it cleared out a bit. Could you say a word about that to the proper person? Why, to be sure, a couple of men with scythes could cut out a track tomorrow morning. I'll leave word as I pass the lodge, and I'll tell them, what'll save you the trouble, perhaps, Mr. Humphreys, of having to go up and extract them yourself, that they'd better have some sticks or a tape to mark out their way with as they go on. A very good idea. Yes, do that, and I'll expect Mrs. and Miss Cooper in the afternoon, and yourself about 10:30 in the morning. It'll be a pleasure, I'm sure, both to them and to myself, Mr. Humphreys. Good night. Humphreys dined at 8. But for the fact that it was his first evening, and that Calton was evidently inclined for occasional conversation, he would have finished the novel he had brought for his journey. As it was, he had to listen and reply to some of Calton's impressions of the neighbourhood and the season. The latter, it appeared, was seasonable, and the former had changed considerably, and not altogether for the worse, since Calton's boyhood, which had been spent there. The village shop, in particular, had greatly improved since the year 1870. It was now possible to procure there pretty much anything you liked, in reason, which was a conveniency, because suppose anything was required of a sudden, and he had known such things before now, he, Calton, could step down there, supposing the shop to be still open, and order it in, without he borrowed it of the rectory, whereas in earlier days it would have been useless to pursue such a course in respect of anything but candles or soap, or treacle, or perhaps a penny child's picture book. and 9 times out of 10 it'd be something more in the nature of a bottle of whisky you'd be requiring. Leastways—" On the whole, Humphreys thought he would be prepared with a book in future. The library was the obvious place for the after-dinner hours. Candle in hand and pipe in mouth, he moved round the room for some time, taking stock of the titles of the books. He had all the predisposition to take interest in an old library, and there was every opportunity for him here to make systematic acquaintance with one, for he had learned from Cooper that there was no catalogue, save the very superficial one made for purposes of probate. The drawing up of a catalogue raisonné would be a delicious occupation for winter. There were probably treasures to be found, too, even manuscripts, if Cooper might be trusted. As he pursued his round, the sense came upon him, as it does upon most of us in similar places, of the extreme unreadableness of a great portion of the collection. Editions of classics and fathers, and Picard's religious ceremonies, and the Harleian miscellany, I suppose, are all very well, but who is ever going to read Tostatus Abulensis, or Pineda on Job, or a book like this? He picked out a small quarto, loose in the binding, and from which the lettered label had fallen off, and, observing that coffee was waiting for him, retired to a chair. Eventually he opened the book. It will be observed that his condemnation of it rested wholly on external grounds. For all he knew, it might have been a collection of unique plays, but undeniably the outside was blank and forbidding. As a matter of fact, it was a collection of sermons or meditations, and mutilated at that, for the first sheet was gone. It seemed to belong to the latter end of the 17th century. He turned over the pages till his eye was caught by a marginal note, a parable of this unhappy condition, and he thought he would see what aptitudes the author might have for imaginative composition. "I have heard or read," so ran the passage, "whether in the way of parable or true relation, I leave my reader to judge, of a man who, like Theseus in the Attic tale, should adventure himself into a labyrinth or maze, and such an one indeed as was not laid out in the fashion of our topiary artists of this age, but of a wide compass, in which, moreover, such unknown pitfalls and snares, nay, such ill-omened inhabitants were commonly thought to lurk, as could only be encountered at the hazard of one's very life. Now, you may be sure that in such a case the dissuasions of friends were not wanting. Consider of such an one, says a brother, how he went the way you wot of, and was never seen more. Or of such another, says the mother, that adventured himself but a little way in, and from that day forth is so troubled in his wits that he cannot tell what he saw, nor hath passed one good night. And have you never heard, cries a neighbour, of what faces have been seen to look out over the palisadoes and betwixt the bars of the gate? But all would not do. The man was set upon his purpose, for it seems it was the common fireside talk of that country, that at the heart and centre of this labyrinth there was a jewel, of such price and rarity that would enrich the finder thereof for his life, and this should be his by right, that could persever to come at it. What then? Quid multa? The adventurer passed the gates, and for a whole day's space his friends without had no news of him, except it might be by some indistinct cries heard afar off in the night, such as made them turn in their restless beds, and sweat for very fear, not doubting but that their son and brother had put one more to the catalogue of those unfortunates that had suffered shipwreck on that voyage. So the next day they went with weeping tears to the clerk of the parish to order the bell to be tolled, and their way took them hard by the gate of the labyrinth, which they would have hastened by, from the horror they had of it, but that they caught sight of a sudden of a man's body lying in the roadway, and going up to it, with what anticipations may be easily figured, found it to be him whom they reckoned as lost, and not dead, though he were in a swound most like death. They then, who had gone forth as mourners, came back rejoicing, and set to by all means to revive their prodigal, who, being come to himself, and hearing of their anxieties, and their errand of that morning, "Ay," says he, "you may as well finish what you were about, for all I have brought back the jewel," which he showed them, and 'twas indeed a rare piece. "I have brought back that with it, that will leave me neither rest at night, nor pleasure by day." Whereupon they were instant with him to learn his meaning, and where his company should be, that went so sore against his stomach. "Oh," says he, "'tis here, in my breast. I cannot flee from it, do what I may." So it needed no wizard to help them to a guess that it was the recollection of what he had seen that troubled him so wonderfully. But they could get no more of him for a long time, but by fits and starts. However, at long and at last they made shift to collect somewhat of this kind, that at first, while the sun was bright, he went merrily on, and without any difficulty reached the heart of the labyrinth, and got the jewel, and so set out on his way back, rejoicing. But as the night fell, wherein all the beasts of the forest do move, he began to be sensible of some creature keeping pace with him, and, as he thought, peering, and looking upon him from the next alley to that he was in, and that when he should stop, this companion should stop also, which put him in some disorder of his spirits. And indeed, as the darkness increased, it seemed to him that there was more than one, and, it might be, even a whole band of such followers. At least, so he judged, by the rustling and cracking that they kept among the thickets. Besides that, there would be at a time a sound of whispering, which seemed to import a conference among them. But in regard of who they were, or what form they were of, he could not be persuaded to say what he thought. Upon his hearers asking him what the cries were, which they heard in the night, as was observed above, he gave them this account, that about midnight, so far as he could judge, he heard his name called from a long way off, and he would have been sworn it was his brother that so called him. So he stood still, and hallooed at the pitch of his voice, and he supposed that the echo, or the noise of his shouting, disguised for the moment any lesser sound, because when there fell a stillness again, he distinguished a trampling, not loud, of running feet coming very close behind him, wherewith he was so daunted that himself set off to run, and that he continued till the dawn broke. Sometimes, when his breath failed him, he would cast himself flat on his face, and hope that his pursuers might overrun him in the darkness. But at such a time they would regularly make a pause, and he could hear them pant and snuff, as it had been a hound at fault, which wrought in him so extreme an horror of mind that he would be forced to betake himself again to turning and doubling, if by any means he might throw them off the scent. And, as if this exertion was in itself not terrible enough, he had before him the constant fear of falling into some pit or trap, of which he had heard, and indeed seen with his own eyes, that there were several, some at the sides and others in the midst of the alleys. So that, in fine, he said, a more dreadful night was never spent by mortal creature than that he had endured in that labyrinth. And not that jewel which he had in his wallet, nor the richest that was ever brought out of the Indies, could be a sufficient recompense to him for the pains he had suffered. I will spare to set down the further recital of this man's troubles, inasmuch as I am confident my reader's intelligence will hit the parallel I desire to draw. For is not this jewel a just emblem of the satisfaction which a man may bring back with him from a course of this world's pleasures? And will not the labyrinth serve for an image of the world itself, wherein such a treasure, if we may believe the common voice, is stored up? At about this point, Humphreys thought that a little patience would be an agreeable change, and that the writer's improvement of his parable might be left to itself. So he put the book back in its former place, wondering, as he did so, whether his uncle had ever stumbled across that passage, and, if so, whether it had worked on his fancy so much as to make him dislike the idea of a maze, and determine to shut up the one in the garden. Not long afterwards he went to bed. The next day brought a morning's hard work with Mr. Cooper, who, if exuberant in language, had the business of the estate at his fingers' ends. He was very breezy this morning, Mr. Cooper was, had not forgotten the order to clear out the maze. The work was going on at that moment. His girl was on the tentacles of expectation about it. He also hoped that Humphreys had slept the sleep of the just, and that we should be favoured with a continuance of this congenial weather. At luncheon he enlarged on the pictures in the dining-room, and pointed out the portrait of the constructor of the temple and the maze. Humphreys examined this with considerable interest. It was the work of an Italian, and had been painted when old Mr. Wilson was visiting Rome as a young man. There was, indeed, a view of the Colosseum in the background. A pale, thin face and large eyes were the characteristic features. In the hand was a partially unfolded roll of paper, on which could be distinguished the plan of a circular building, very probably the temple, and also part of that of a labyrinth. Humphreys got up on a chair to examine it, but it was not painted with sufficient clearness to be worth copying. It suggested to him, however, that he might as well make a plan of his own maze and hang it in the hall for the use of visitors. This determination of his was confirmed that same afternoon, for when Mrs. and Miss Cooper arrived, eager to be inducted into the maze, he found that he was wholly unable to lead them to the centre. The gardeners had removed the guide marks they had been using, and even Clutterham, when summoned to assist, was as helpless as the rest. "The point is, you see, Mr. Wilson, I should say Humphreys, these mazes is purposely constructed so much alike, with a view to mislead. Still, if you'll follow me, I think I can put you right. I'll just put my hat down here as a starting point." He stumped off, and after 5 minutes brought the party safe to the hat again. "Now that's a very peculiar thing," he said, with a sheepish laugh. "I made sure I'd left that hat just over against a bramble bush, and you can see for yourself there ain't no bramble bush, not in this walk at all. If you'll allow me, Mr. Humphreys, that's the name, ain't it, sir? I'll just call one of the men in to mark the place, like." William Crack arrived in answer to repeated shouts. He had some difficulty in making his way to the party. First he was seen or heard in an inside alley, then, almost at the same moment, in an outer one. However, he joined them at last, and was first consulted without effect, and then stationed by the hat, which Clutterham still considered it necessary to leave on the ground. In spite of this strategy, they spent the best part of 3/4 of an hour in quite fruitless wanderings, and Humphreys was obliged at last, seeing how tired Mrs. Cooper was becoming, to suggest a retreat to tea, with profuse apologies to Miss Cooper. "At any rate, you've won your bet with Miss Foster," he said. "You have been inside the maze, and I promise you the first thing I do shall be to make a proper plan of it with the lines marked out for you to go by." "That's what's wanted, sir," said Clutterham. Someone to draw out a plan and keep it by them. It might be very awkward, you see. Anyone getting into that place, and a shower of rain come on, and them not able to find their way out again. It might be hours before they could be got out, without you'd permit of me making a short cut to the middle. What my meaning is, taking down a couple of trees in each edge in a straight line, so as you could get a clear view right through. Of course, that'd do away with it as a maze, but I don't know as you'd approve of that. No, I won't have that done yet. I'll make a plan first and let you have a copy. Later on, if we find occasion, I'll think of what you say. Humphreys was vexed and ashamed at the fiasco of the afternoon, and could not be satisfied without making another effort that evening to reach the centre of the maze. His irritation was increased by finding it without a single false step. He had thoughts of beginning his plan at once, but the light was fading, and he felt that by the time he had got the necessary materials together, work would be impossible. Next morning, accordingly, carrying a drawing-board, pencils, compasses, cartridge paper, and so forth, some of which had been borrowed from the Coopers, and some found in the library cupboards, he went to the middle of the maze, again without any hesitation, and set out his materials. He was, however, delayed in making a start. The brambles and weeds that had obscured the column and globe were now all cleared away, and it was for the first time possible to see clearly what these were like. The column was featureless, resembling those on which sundials are usually placed. Not so the globe. I have said that it was finely engraved with figures and inscriptions, and that on a first glance Humphreys had taken it for a celestial globe. But he soon found that it did not answer to his recollection of such things. One feature seemed familiar. A winged serpent, Draco, encircled it, about the place which, on a terrestrial globe, is occupied by the equator. But on the other hand, a good part of the upper hemisphere was covered by the outspread wings of a large figure whose head was concealed by a ring at the pole or summit of the whole. Around the place of the head, the words Princeps Tenebrarum could be deciphered. In the lower hemisphere, there was a space hatched all over with cross lines and marked as Umbra Mortis. Near it was a range of mountains, and among them a valley with flames rising from it. This was lettered, will you be surprised to learn it, Vallis Filiorum Hinnom. Above and below Draco were outlined various figures, not unlike the pictures of the ordinary constellations, but not the same. Thus, a nude man with a raised club was described not as Hercules, but as Cain. Another, plunged up to his middle in earth, and stretching out despairing arms, was Kore, not Ophiuchus. And a third, hung by his hair to a snaky tree, was Absalon. Near the last, a man in long robes and high cap, standing in a circle and addressing two shaggy demons who hovered outside, was described as Hostanus Magus, a character unfamiliar to Humphreys. The scheme of the whole, indeed, seemed to be an assemblage of the patriarchs of evil, perhaps not uninfluenced by a study of Dante. Humphreys thought it an unusual exhibition of his great-grandfather's taste, but reflected that he had probably picked it up in Italy, and had never taken the trouble to examine it closely. Certainly, had he set much store by it, he would not have exposed it to wind and weather. He tapped the metal. It seemed hollow and not very thick, and, turning from it, addressed himself to his plan. After half an hour's work, he found it was impossible to get on without using a clue, so he procured a roll of twine from Clutterham, and laid it out along the alleys from the entrance to the centre, tying the end to the ring at the top of the globe. This expedient helped him to set out a rough plan before luncheon, and in the afternoon he was able to draw it in more neatly. Towards tea-time, Mr. Cooper joined him, and was much interested in his progress. "Now this," said Mr. Cooper, laying his hand on the globe, and then drawing it away hastily. "Phew! Holds the heat, doesn't it? To a surprising degree, Mr. Humphreys. I suppose this metal, copper, isn't it, would be an insulator or conductor, or whatever they call it." "The sun has been pretty strong this afternoon," said Humphreys, evading the scientific point. "But I didn't notice the globe had got hot." "No, it doesn't seem very hot to me," he added. "Odd," said Mr. Cooper. "Now I can't hardly bear my hand on it. Something in the difference of temperament between us, I suppose. I dare say you're a chilly subject, Mr. Humphreys. I'm not, and that's where the distinction lies. All this summer I've slept, if you'll believe me, practically in statu quo, and had my morning tub as cold as I could get it, day out and day in. Let me assist you with that string." "Oh, it's all right, thanks. But if you'll collect some of these pencils and things that are lying about, I shall be much obliged. Now, I think we've got everything, and we might get back to the house." They left the maze, Humphreys rolling up the clue as they went. The night was rainy. Most unfortunately, it turned out that, whether by Cooper's fault or not, the plan had been the one thing forgotten the evening before. As was to be expected, it was ruined by the wet. There was nothing for it but to begin again. The job would not be a long one this time. The clue, therefore, was put in place once more, and a fresh start made. But Humphreys had not done much before an interruption came in the shape of Carlton with a telegram. His late chief in London wanted to consult him. Only a brief interview was wanted, but the summons was urgent. This was annoying, yet it was not really upsetting. There was a train available in half an hour, and unless things went very cross, he could be back, possibly by 5 o'clock, certainly by 8. He gave the plan to Carlton to take to the house, but it was not worth while to remove the clue. All went as he had hoped. He spent a rather exciting evening in the library, for he lighted tonight upon a cupboard where some of the rarer books were kept. When he went up to bed, he was glad to find that the servant had remembered to leave his curtains undrawn and his windows open. He put down his light and went to the window which commanded a view of the garden and the park. It was a brilliant moonlight night. In a few weeks' time, the sonorous winds of autumn would break up all this calm. But now the distant woods were in a deep stillness. The slopes of the lawns were shining with dew. The colours of some of the flowers could almost be guessed. The light of the moon just caught the cornice of the temple and the curve of its leaden dome, and Humphreys had to own that, so seen, these conceits of a past age have a real beauty. In short, the light, the perfume of the woods, and the absolute quiet called up such kind old associations in his mind that he went on ruminating them for a long, long time. As he turned from the window, he felt he had never seen anything more complete of its sort. The one feature that struck him with a sense of incongruity was a small Irish yew, thin and black, which stood out like an outpost of the shrubbery through which the maze was approached. That, he thought, might as well be a way. The wonder was that anyone should have thought it would look well in that position. However, next morning, in the press of answering letters and going over books with Mr. Cooper, the Irish yew was forgotten. One letter, by the way, arrived this day which has to be mentioned. It was from that Lady Wardrop whom Miss Cooper had mentioned, and it renewed the application which she had addressed to Mr. Wilson. She pleaded, in the first place, that she was about to publish a book of mazes, and earnestly desired to include the plan of the Willsthorpe maze, and also that it would be a great kindness if Mr. Humphreys could let her see it, if at all, at an early date, since she would soon have to go abroad for the winter months. Her house at Bentley was not far distant, so Humphreys was able to send a note by hand to her, suggesting the very next day, or the day after, for her visit. It may be said at once that the messenger brought back a most grateful answer, to the effect that the morrow would suit her admirably. The only other event of the day was that the plan of the maze was successfully finished. This night again was fair and brilliant and calm, and Humphreys lingered almost as long at his window. The Irish yew came to his mind again, as he was on the point of drawing his curtains, but either he had been misled by a shadow the night before, or else the shrub was not really so obtrusive as he had fancied. Anyhow, he saw no reason for interfering with it. What he would do away with, however, was a clump of dark growth which had usurped a place against the house wall, and was threatening to obscure one of the lower range of windows. It did not look as if it could possibly be worth keeping. He fancied it dank and unhealthy, little as he could see of it. Next day, it was a Friday, he had arrived at Wilsthorpe on a Monday, Lady Wardrop came over in her car soon after luncheon. She was a stout, elderly person, very full of talk of all sorts, and particularly inclined to make herself agreeable to Humphreys, who had gratified her very much by his ready granting of her request. They made a thorough exploration of the place together, and Lady Wardrop's opinion of her host obviously rose sky-high when she found that he really knew something of gardening. She entered enthusiastically into all his plans for improvement, but agreed that it would be a vandalism to interfere with the characteristic laying out of the ground near the house. With the temple she was particularly delighted, and, said she, "Do you know, Mr. Humphreys, I think your bailiff must be right about those lettered blocks of stone. One of my mazes, I'm sorry to say the stupid people have destroyed it now, it was at a place in Hampshire, had the track marked out in that way. They were tiles there, but lettered just like yours, and the letters, taken in the right order, formed an inscription. What it was, I forget. Something about Theseus and Ariadne. I have a copy of it, as well as the plan of the maze where it was. How people can do such things! I shall never forgive you if you injure your maze. Do you know, they're becoming very uncommon. Almost every year I hear of one being grubbed up. Now, do let's get straight to it. Or, if you're too busy, I know my way there perfectly, and I'm not afraid of getting lost in it. I know too much about mazes for that. Though I remember missing my lunch, not so very long ago either, through getting entangled in the one at Busbury. Well, of course, if you can manage to come with me, that will be all the nicer." After this confident prelude, justice would seem to require that Lady Wardrop should have been hopelessly muddled by the Wilsthorpe maze. Nothing of that kind happened, yet it is to be doubted whether she got all the enjoyment from her new specimen that she expected. She was interested, keenly interested, to be sure, and pointed out to Humphreys a series of little depressions in the ground, which, she thought, marked the places of the lettered blocks. She told him, too, what other mazes resembled his most closely in arrangement, and explained how it was usually possible to date a maze to within 20 years by means of its plan. This one, she already knew, must be about as old as 1780, and its features were just what might be expected. The globe, furthermore, completely absorbed her. It was unique in her experience, and she pored over it for long. "I should like a rubbing of that," she said, "if it could possibly be made." "Yes, I am sure you would be most kind about it, Mr. Humphreys, but I trust you won't attempt it on my account. I do indeed. I shouldn't like to take any liberties here. I have the feeling that it might be resented. Now, confess," she went on, turning and facing Humphreys. "Don't you feel, haven't you felt, ever since you came in here, that a watch is being kept on us, and that if we overstepped the mark in any way, there would be a pounce? No? I do, and I don't care how soon we are outside the gate." "After all," she said, when they were once more on their way to the house, "it may have been only the airlessness and the dull heat of that place that pressed on my brain. Still, I'll take back one thing I said. I'm not sure that I shan't forgive you after all, if I find next spring that maze has been grubbed up. Whether or no that's done, you shall have the plan, Lady Wardrop. I have made one, and no later than tonight I can trace you a copy. Admirable. A pencil tracing will be all I want, with an indication of the scale. I can easily have it brought into line with the rest of my plates. Many, many thanks. Very well. You shall have that tomorrow. I wish you could help me to a solution of my block puzzle. What, those stones in the summer-house? That is a puzzle. They are in no sort of order? No, of course not. But the men who put them down must have had some directions. Perhaps you'll find a paper about it among your uncle's things. If not, you'll have to call in somebody who's an expert in ciphers. Advise me about something else, please, said Humphreys. That bush thing under the library window. You would have that away, wouldn't you? Which? That? Oh, I think not, said Lady Wardrop. I can't see it very well from this distance, but it's not unsightly. Perhaps you're right. Only, looking out of my window, just above it, last night, I thought it took up too much room. It doesn't seem to, as one sees it from here, certainly. Very well, I'll leave it alone for a bit. Tea was the next business, soon after which Lady Wardrop drove off. But halfway down the drive, she stopped the car and beckoned to Humphreys, who was still on the front door steps. He ran to glean her parting words, which were, "It just occurs to me, it might be worth your while to look at the underside of those stones. They must have been numbered, mustn't they? Goodbye again. Home, please." The main occupation of this evening, at any rate, was settled. The tracing of the plan for Lady Wardrop, and the careful collation of it with the original, meant a couple of hours' work at least. Accordingly, soon after 9, Humphreys had his materials put out in the library, and began. It was a still, stuffy evening. Windows had to stand open, and he had more than one grisly encounter with a bat. These unnerving episodes made him keep the tail of his eye on the window. Once or twice it was a question whether there was, not a bat, but something more considerable, that had a mind to join him. How unpleasant it would be if someone had slipped noiselessly over the sill, and was crouching on the floor. The tracing of the plan was done. It remained to compare it with the original, and to see whether any paths had been wrongly closed or left open. With one finger on each paper, he traced out the course that must be followed from the entrance. There were one or two slight mistakes, but here, near the centre, was a bad confusion, probably due to the entry of the second or third bat. Before correcting the copy, he followed out carefully the last turnings of the path on the original. These, at least, were right. They led without a hitch to the middle space. Here was a feature which need not be repeated on the copy. An ugly black spot, about the size of a shilling. Ink? No. It resembled a hole. But how should a hole be there? He stared at it with tired eyes. The work of tracing had been very laborious, and he was drowsy and oppressed. But surely this was a very odd hole. It seemed to go not only through the paper, but through the table on which it lay. Yes, and through the floor below that. Down, and still down, even into infinite depths. He craned over it, utterly bewildered. Just as, when you were a child, you may have pored over a square inch of counterpane until it became a landscape with wooded hills, and perhaps even churches and houses, and you lost all thought of the true size of yourself and it. So this hole seemed to Humphreys, for the moment, the only thing in the world. For some reason it was hateful to him from the first. But he had gazed at it for some moments before any feeling of anxiety came upon him. And then it did come. Stronger and stronger. A horror, lest something might emerge from it, and a really agonizing conviction that a terror was on its way, from the sight of which he would not be able to escape. Oh, yes. Far, far down, there was a movement. And the movement was upwards, towards the surface. Nearer and nearer it came, and it was of a blackish-grey colour, with more than one dark hole. It took shape as a face, a human face, a burnt human face, and with the odious writhings of a wasp creeping out of a rotten apple, there clambered forth an appearance of a form, waving black arms, prepared to clasp the head that was bending over them. With a convulsion of despair, Humphreys threw himself back, struck his head against a hanging lamp, and fell. There was concussion of the brain, shock to the system, and a long confinement to bed. The doctor was badly puzzled, not by the symptoms, but by a request which Humphreys made to him as soon as he was able to say anything. "I wish you would open the ball in the maze." "Hardly room enough there, I should have thought," was the best answer he could summon up. "But it's more in your way than mine. My dancing days are over." At which Humphreys muttered and turned over to sleep, and the doctor intimated to the nurses that the patient was not out of the wood yet. When he was better able to express his views, Humphreys made his meaning clear, and received a promise that the thing should be done at once. He was so anxious to learn the result that the doctor, who seemed a little pensive next morning, saw that more harm than good would be done by saving up his report. "Well," he said, "I am afraid the ball is done for. The metal must have worn thin, I suppose. Anyhow, it went all to bits with the first blow of the chisel." "Well, go on, do," said Humphreys impatiently. "Oh, you want to know what we found in it, of course. Well, it was half full of stuff like ashes." "Ashes? What did you make of them?" "I haven't thoroughly examined them yet. There's hardly been time. But Cooper's made up his mind, I dare say from something I said, that it's a case of cremation. Now, don't excite yourself, my good sir. Yes, I must allow, I think he's probably right." The maze is gone, and Lady Wardrop has forgiven Humphreys. In fact, I believe he married her niece. She was right, too, in her conjecture that the stones in the temple were numbered. There had been a numeral painted on the bottom of each. Some few of these had rubbed off, but enough remained to enable Humphreys to reconstruct the inscription. It ran thus: "Penetrans ad interiora mortis." Grateful as Humphreys was to the memory of his uncle, he could not quite forgive him for having burnt the journals and letters of the James Wilson who had gifted Wilsthorpe with the maze and the temple. As to the circumstances of that ancestor's death and burial, no tradition survived. But his will, which was almost the only record of him accessible, assigned an unusually generous legacy to a servant who bore an Italian name. Mr. Cooper's view is that, humanly speaking, all these many solemn events have a meaning for us, if our limited intelligence permitted of our disintegrating it, while Mr. Calton has been reminded of an aunt, now gone from us, who, about the year 1866, had been lost for upwards of an hour and a half in the maze at Covent Gardens, or it might be Hampton Court. One of the oddest things in the whole series of transactions is that the book which contained the parable has entirely disappeared. Humphreys has never been able to find it, since he copied out the passage to send to Lady Wardrop. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you'd like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, and you can also purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2022. Thank you for listening.